All right, let's deconstruct rationality. We did a thorough deconstruction of science and materialism in my series, Deconstructing the Myth of Science. This is going to be an analog series where we're going to be focusing on rationality and its limits. This will be a three-part series with the deepest insights coming in part 2 and part 3. Make sure you stick around for those remaining parts. I stress that because you know what the average view time for one of my videos is? It's about 20 to 30 minutes. If you're going to be only watching for 20 to 30 minutes one of my videos, you might as well not even be watching at all because you're not going to learn anything, really. Maybe even it'll harm you more than it'll help you. So really, make sure you stick to the end because there's a lot of juicy stuff here. This is original intellectual work. I've been working on this for a long, long time. You're not going to find this kind of information anywhere else. There's hundreds of critical insights throughout this whole series. It's very dense. I've been preparing it for months. There's enough information here for a dense book or a PhD thesis. I mean, this is really like a philosophy PhD wrapped into 3 episodes. So it's going to take about 10 hours to explain this whole topic. So please be patient. The only thing I can promise you is that it's going to be worth it because it's going to change how you understand how the mind works, how you understand science, how you understand academia, a lot of stuff like this. Now, you've probably intuited that there's something wrong with highly rational people, but it's not so easy to put your finger on exactly what's wrong with them, because usually such people are pretty intelligent, they have a high IQ and so on, and they're well educated in the formal sense of having gone to university and having some credentials and degrees and maybe even a PhD. But still, these people don't understand reality fundamentally. Why is that? Well, this series is going to be a complete technical explication of how and why rationalism limits your mind and prevents you from making sense of reality. And it explains why rationalism cannot reach ultimate truth and ultimate understanding. Rationalism is a subtle paradigm. It's an invisible paradigm. You're not conscious of it, even though you hold it, and it grounds your sense of reality. So this series is going to help you to move from rationalism, from rationality into post-rationality. This is a conceptual framework for advanced transhuman mystical cognition. This is a critical topic for developing higher stages of cognitive development, which is what I teach. It's particularly important for people in the STEM fields and in academia. So this series is not for soft New Age people. Those people need to learn basic rationality. This series is for people who have learned and gone deep into rationality, the scientists and so forth, but have gotten stuck in that and how to get them beyond that into the post-rational domain. Now, a lot of credit here needs to be given to David Chapman from a website called Metarationality.com. Very important website. It's like a whole book, basically. It's like an online book. I encourage you to go to Metarationality.com and read the whole thing. It's going to take you weeks to read it all. There's a lot of important information in there. I'm going to be quoting and citing a lot of things that he said here, especially in the first part. And then in part 2 and part 3, we're going to be expanding and going even beyond what David Chapman's work, excellent work, he's done. So a lot of credit to him, and I'll be quoting him throughout this episode over and over again. So we're sort of starting with his foundation, and then we're building on top of that to go even beyond. Now, a few warnings here before we really get into the meat of it. Warning number 1 is that this is advanced philosophy, which nobody really understands. Academics, scientists do not understand what I'm going to be talking about, especially in part 2 and part 3. It took me over 20 years of philosophy work to understand what I'm going to be sharing with you over this series. This requires crazy levels of open-mindedness. And this is not any kind of belief system that I want you to adopt. These are insights that I want you to contemplate for yourself. And only if you contemplate it deeply and you see the truth of it, then you should hold these ideas. Otherwise, don't adopt this as a belief system. The other warning is that do not be misled by the term deconstruction. You might think deconstruction is something that's coming from postmodernism. And while postmodernism has valid insights and some of these ideas that I'm going to be sharing do overlap with postmodernism, what I'm talking about here goes way, way, way beyond postmodernism. So this is not just a rehashing of stuff from, silly postmodern philosophy. We're going way beyond that. And the other warning is that spiritual things will be mentioned here, so be careful. people who are in the rationalist paradigm very deeply, they have a spiritual allergy. So watch out for that spiritual allergy. I might be using the word God here and there. I might be using other mystical terms here and there. Just be careful that you don't get turned off by that. Remember, keep an open mind. Keep an open mind. And the other warning is that a key mistake that many rationalists make is that any critique of rationality is interpreted as a promotion of irrationality or woo. After all, anything that isn't rational must be irrational, right? Those are the only two options. Or it's like the only reason you would want to oppose rationality is because you have some irrational thing that you want to promote, some fantasy, some delusion, some falsehood, some cult ideology. But notice that this is question begging, right? We need to explore and think about what is rationality really? And are there flaws within it? Are there problems? You can't just assume that there aren't any. So this brings us to the pre-trans fallacy that Ken Wilber talks about. There's pre-rational, there's rational, and then there's post-rational. And so the mistake that the people at the rational stage make is that they think that any criticism of the rational must come from the pre-rational. Something like a flat earther criticizing, science. That would be an example of a pre-rational critique of the rational. That's obviously not what we're promoting here. There's a distinction you need to make in your mind that you can criticize things from above or from below. A criticism of rationality from below would be maybe from a religious fundamentalist, or from a flat earther, something like that. Somebody who hasn't mastered rationality, somebody who hasn't actually understood science, the methods of science. But then once you do master science and you learn it, and you learn the methods of science, the kind of bog standard stuff that they teach you in academia, then you start to wonder, is there anything beyond that? Is there any kind of cognition, any way to use the mind beyond that? And it turns out that there is, and then that would open you up to the post-rational. And then from the post-rational, you can criticize the rational. And that is not irrational, and that is not because you want to promote some kind of fantasy or delusion, but because there are legitimate limits to the rational stage. And these are stages of cognition that we're talking about. Another warning is that for those of you who are into spirituality and New Age type people, and especially if you didn't go to academia and you didn't study hard sciences, then you actually suffer from being too much in the pre-rational. You haven't actually mastered the rational stage of cognitive development. That's something you need to work on, and that's not what this series is about. This series is more advanced. This is about transcending the rational, which is different than learning the rational, and it's important that you learn to be rational, because otherwise you will be irrational, and that's not good. That's going to lead to problems in your understanding of reality and in your life. And a lot of New Age spiritual woo-type people do suffer from irrationality. That's not a made-up thing. That's real. And they would benefit from just learning rationality, but I'm not going to teach you rationality here. I'm going to teach you how to go beyond that. So just remember that developing rationality is an important thing. And that's also how you know that what I'm talking about here is coming from a higher stage rather than a lower stage, is because I'm not here to demonize rationality. I'm not here to tell you not to learn science or not to learn rationality. You should learn those things. Those are important. And then that's how you know that I'm trying to teach you something a little bit beyond that. Because otherwise, I'd just be demonizing it and strawmanning it, which I'm not going to be doing. Now, immediately we should tackle an objection here, which is something like this. But Leo, aren't you contradicting yourself already? Because here you are using rationality to try to deconstruct rationality, thereby, doesn't that prove rationality's validity? After all, isn't this whole conversation you using logic and making various kinds of arguments and points, and isn't that rationality? So how can rationality be wrong? If rationality is wrong, then your critique of rationality must also be wrong, right? This is not a contradiction. It might seem this way on the surface, but it's not. Notice that rationality, if we think of it as a kind of a cognitive system, it's able to reflect on itself and to find faults within itself. This is not a mistake or a contradiction. This is essential. This is essential. A system's ability to reflect on itself, to go meta on itself. This is the essence of what development and reaching higher stages of cognition is all about. Notice that rationality is capable of self-awareness of its own limits. To turn rationality into a system that doesn't self-reflect, that doesn't question itself, and doesn't admit any limits to itself, that itself is to turn it into a dogma, and that itself is a kind of irrationality. And notice that rationality can be turned into a dogma. People do this. So it's not at all a contradiction that people who claim to be highly rational are actually irrational. That might sound like, well, but that's not possible, right? If someone is acting rational, then they're rational. They can't be irrational, but no, they can. And in fact, you can get so wrapped up in acting rational that you don't see your own irrationality, because that requires something more than rational. To see the irrationality in how you apply your rational ideas and your rational belief system, which we might call rationalism, this requires consciousness and self-reflection and something that goes beyond just merely application of logic. After all, why would you assume that rationality has no limits? It would be irrational to assume that. So it actually is possible for rationality to become irrational. That's not a contradiction. Or rather, it is a contradiction, but to be able to see that contradiction within yourself is actually the whole point of this series, is to teach you that, to help you to see those contradictions. Because just because you are rational or you think of yourself as rational doesn't mean that your worldview doesn't have contradictions within it. It certainly does. Certainly does. So here's a key framing question for this entire investigation that we're doing. It's this: how does rationality become self-deception? If you just contemplate that one question for years, you will derive all the insights that I will be sharing with you throughout this whole series. That's really where all of this is coming from. That's the source. So here's the core insight for you, is that rationality has limits. Once you suspect that that's true, then you can ask questions like, well, what are the limits of rationality? How is rationality a trap? How is rationality misused and abused? How does rationality get metaphysics and epistemology wrong? How does rationality limit intelligence? How is rationality an obstacle towards the highest understanding of reality? What is rationality? What is reason? And what is reason's relationship to truth? You can just turn off this whole series right here and just contemplate these questions for years, and you will get all of the information that I would be teaching you, which is how this is different from any kind of ideology or belief system, right? I want you to contemplate these questions deeply for yourself and to have these insights for yourself. But because it takes so long, it took me 20 years to understand this stuff, really, it's too much to expect people to just do it casually. Like, this is very serious philosophy. So it really helps to have someone who's gone through this whole process who can point out the things you should be contemplating and the various traps. And, some of these things just take a lot of creativity just to have certain kinds of insights. You wouldn't even think of them on your own in 20 years if somebody didn't point them out to you. And sometimes it's just lucky that I have one of these insights, across 20 years, I have a few of these insights and I compile them all together, and then that's what this is. That's the value of it. If you work a lot with rational systems, you will notice that rational methods often fail, leading to wrong conclusions, delusions, and wrong sense-making, failure to understand reality, failure to predict reality. And rational fields start to stagnate and to get stuck in themselves. There's a key 4-part distinction we're going to be making here, which is we're going to want to distinguish between reason, reasonableness, rationality, and rationalism. Credit to David Chapman for this important distinction. So I'm not going to fully define these right now for you. In about an hour or two, when we get towards the last part of this episode, I'm going to give you some definitions of these. But for now, just contemplate what might be the difference between reason, reasonableness, rationality, and rationalism. For our purposes right now, as we kind of bootstrap this investigation, let's focus on just the difference between rationality and rationalism. Rationality is some kind of function that your mind is performing. Let's just start there. And then rationalism is, what is that? Well, that would be to turn rationality into some kind of ism or some kind of system. So you can also have the parallel here between, you can have science and then you can have scientism. What's the difference between science and scientism? We have an analogous difference between rationality and rationalism. So a lot of what this whole episode is about deconstructing rationalism. And then rationality itself, well, we're going to maintain that, of course. We're not going to stop using rationality. We're going to keep using it, but also we're going to learn, as we talk about the limits of rationalism, we're also going to learn about the limits of rationality as well. So my thesis for this whole series is that rationalism is a self-deception and not the highest form of intelligence nor cognitive development. But to understand what that really means, we need to define in a lot of depth what is rationalism. So let's go into that right now. I have a list for you. It's worth our time to really set this up and to think about what is rationalism, to really define it deeply, because that's what we're deconstructing. And see, the trick with rationalism is that you probably don't consciously think of yourself as a rationalist. You probably don't identify that way, but nevertheless, you probably subscribe, if not to the entire paradigm that I'll be describing here in a second, then to important parts of it, right? And it's not the case that you need to subscribe to the whole thing to be limited by it. Whichever parts of it you subscribe to will limit your mind's ability to cognize and to understand reality. All right, so let's define what is rationalism. Rationalism is a worldview, first of all. It's an implicit epistemic paradigm. And by implicit, what we mean is that most people who hold it, they're not conscious that they're holding it, but they do hold it, and nevertheless, it limits them. It's also a faith in the power of reason to solve all problems, all sense-making, all truth-seeking. It's, quote, any belief system that makes exaggerated claims about the power of rationality, usually involving a formal guarantee of correctness, end quote. These quotes here are all from David Chapman. So I'm not going to keep repeating his name. Just if I'm quoting something and I'm not telling you where I'm quoting it from in this episode, it's all coming from David Chapman and his website, Metarationality.com. He also says, quote, rationalism means that, quote, rationality is all there is to thinking and acting well. It is sufficient for all purposes, and there's nothing else that you need. This implies that there's nothing better. There's no better system. There's no better epistemology than rationality. Rationalism is also, quote, specifies some ultimate criterion according to which thinking or acting could be judged to be correct or optimal, end quote. And it's, quote, thinking in accordance with this criterion leads to true beliefs. And it also claims that rationality yields maximally effective action, end quote. Rationalism is trying to think about reality in formal ways as a means of solving the problem of distinguishing truth from falsehood. So this is the key issue that we deal with when we're talking about the mind, and we're talking about epistemology, philosophy, science, anything, is really ultimately what we're talking about. We can all boil it down to, how do you distinguish truth from falsehood? That's the really tricky question. How do you do that? And rationalism's answer is that, well, you do that by becoming more and more formal. You look for formal ways. And what do we mean by formal ways? And we're going to be using this term called formalism. What does that mean? Well, see, just think about it. Before there was official codified scientific method, which only has existed for about 500 years, let's say, since this European scientific revolution. Before that, how did human beings make sense of reality? Well, this was the pre-rational era of human civilization, which is the majority of human civilization was pre-rational. So this was before official scientific method. People still did science, but it wasn't formalized. To formalize something is to lay it down into a sort of a law or into rules or into official kind of method, and then to teach it by institutions and through culture and all this kind of stuff. So, the ancient Egyptians, we can ask the question, like, did the ancient Egyptians have science? Well, in a certain sense, obviously, yes, because they built some incredible stuff. You can't build the pyramids without some kind of advanced understanding of nature and reality and how to carve rocks. I mean, you could call all that science. On the other hand, it wasn't like a formal scientific method the way that we have now. So in a certain sense, they didn't have science. But nevertheless, they were able to understand reality. And also notice that, it was mixed in with a lot of superstition. It was mixed in with mystical ideas and religious ideas and all sorts of false ideas as well. So what is the reasoning behind formalizing scientific method? Well, it's supposed to be like, we're becoming more rigorous, and therefore the reason for becoming more rigorous is because there's a lot of sloppy stuff. If you're using your mind in a sloppy way, if you're doing science in a sloppy way, then you're going to get a lot of truth mixed with a lot of falsehood as well. You're going to get superstition, you're going to get woo, you're going to get falsehood, and you're going to get delusions and self-deceptions, which is all common in the pre-rational stages of human cognition. So then as you formalize, as you use rigorous method, you do double-blind placebo-controlled studies. That's an example of formalization. You don't imagine that the ancient Egyptians did any kind of double-blind placebo-controlled studies about their religious beliefs, right? They just believed stuff. And so, they probably believed a lot of false stuff, even if they believed some true stuff as well. So the idea is that by, formalizing our studies and being very rigorous and having people proofread our work and writing, formal research papers, citing all of our sources, by doing this kind of formal method, then we're eliminating the untruth and we're separating the truth from the untruth. And in this way, we're creating the distinction between science and pseudoscience. So we might say, as modernists, we might say that the ancient Egyptians had a lot of pseudoscience, but also some legitimate science mixed in. It's just mixed, complex bag. But we don't like having pseudoscience and science mixed together. We want something more pure, more true. We want to get rid of all the falsehood and the delusion. So we formalize. Another way to think about formalism is think about a concept like, for example, intelligence. You can have a folk notion of intelligence, like, oh, that person's really smart. She's really intelligent. We can just kind of talk about it informally that way. And we're capturing some reality when we say that. But on the other hand, what is intelligence? It's this amorphous, nebulous, fuzzy concept. How do we define it in a rigorous way? So a scientist comes along and says, well, okay, so, it's no good to just talk about intelligence, using our intuition of who's smart and who isn't. We need to start measuring this stuff. So let's come up with some kind of, first of all, let's define what intelligence is. And we can say that, well, intelligence is your ability to solve math problems quickly. That might be one measure. Another measure is that, it's your verbal abilities, your reading comprehension. And we could design some kind of test to measure that. And maybe it's your ability to solve geometric puzzles, rotating objects like on an IQ test. So, we can come up with like a 4-point definition of what intelligence is. And then we can design a test to measure each of those. And then we can give these tests to people. And then we get an IQ test. And then we can give someone a number. And then based on that, it seems like, okay, see, we've formalized this fuzzy notion called intelligence into something a little bit more rigorous. But then the question becomes, well, is that though really what intelligence is? Or is that an artificial construct of the human mind? And maybe it doesn't really capture what intelligence is. Maybe intelligence is something beyond just what this IQ test is capturing. But then, of course, the limitation becomes if we start to take our construct too seriously without being aware that it's a construct, then we can get trapped into thinking that we understand intelligence better than we actually do. So this is formalism. Rationalism is all about formalism as a solution to this problem of distinguishing truth from falsehood. Rationalism is also attempts to create laws of thinking, creating a method for right thinking. Like, wouldn't it be ideal? Because, the human mind is so full of bullshit. Most of the time, it's easy to bullshit with the human mind. And so how do we learn to think properly? what are the laws of thinking? Wouldn't it be ideal if we could just come up with some kind of formula for how to get to the truth? So rationalism wants to do that. It wants to find those laws of thinking. But maybe those laws don't exist. We have to be open to that possibility as well. We can't just assume that they do. Also, maybe you create these laws, but then those laws actually limit your ability to think. We have to also consider that possibility. So this is all very tricky stuff. Rationalism is also normative. Normative means that others ought to follow it. Everyone ought to be rationalist, according to the rationalist. That's the proper way to be. Because if you're not a rationalist, according to the rationalist, then you're some sort of deluded New Age person or some soft-brained, fuzzy intuitive person who believes in a bunch of woo. Rationalism is the assumption that anything that is true can be arrived at by rationality, and if rationality can't arrive at it, then it cannot be true. Rationalism is the attempt to create an objective replacement for intuition, because intuition is subjective, fuzzy, and unreliable. Rationalism is the attempt to make human sense-making as rigorous and objective as mathematics. Mathematics is sort of like the gold standard for the rationalist or for the scientist, because the truths of mathematics can be elegantly written in just simple equations, and then those equations can be checked. We can even build a computer program to check for the validity of our equations and our logical proofs. And so wouldn't that be ideal if we could just have a computer program that can just check any statement or any belief system or any worldview for its correctness? And in this way, we can eliminate any kind of delusions from our understanding of reality. But it's an open question whether that's even possible, though. Rationalism is an inclination towards systemic theoretic approaches to understanding the world. It's the attempt to make all of reality explicit, formalized, and quantified. Formalism is assumed to be more true than any other kind of knowing. If it isn't formal, it isn't serious, and it isn't real. If you can't formalize it, it's not real at all. If it can't be quantified, it isn't real. If it can't be measured, it isn't real. Rationalism is the notion that all informal human notions of reality can simply be formalized with enough work, and that nothing important or truthful would be lost if we did so. It's the attempt to boil all of reality down to a set of logical, true, false propositions and statements. It's sense-making and understanding turned into propositional knowledge. And in a sense, that's what formal science is trying to do. That's what the whole game of academia is. You go into academia, and your job is to contribute to mankind's knowledge base. And what do we mean by propositional knowledge? Well, propositional knowledge is like, we might think of it as statements that are true or false about the world. For example, the earth is round, true or false? True, okay? That's a propositional statement. And then, snow is white. Is that true or false? Well, it's true, okay. And then the moon is made of cheese. Is that true or false? No, it's false, okay. And then, so you could think of science in a simplistic manner as just a list of all the true propositions about the world. And then a scientist's job or an academic's job is to, research more and more of the world and to contribute to this giant database of true and false statements about the world. And that if we just collect and grow and expand this database of propositional knowledge, that eventually we'll just understand the whole universe. And that's all that there is to science. That's all that there is to reason. That's all there is to using the mind. That's all there is to truth. Truth just is a database of everything that's true about the world in propositional form. Or is it? Rationalism is the treating of complex phenomena as analyzable and reducible to formal logical statements. If you go to university freshman logic classes, they will teach you how to reduce questions about the world and about nature into logical forms, where it's like they even have this kind of special notation. It's called first order logic. There's second order logic and so forth. But it teaches you how to sort of reduce everything into syllogistic forms. By syllogistic form, I mean stuff like, Socrates is a man. Statement number one. Like, claim number two is that all men are mortal. And then the conclusion is, Socrates, therefore, it must be mortal. This is freshman first order logic class kind of stuff. And rationalism is the notion that you can reduce sense making to that kind of thing. It's attempts to understand reality through logical syllogisms. The beauty of logical syllogisms is that they're deductive, and that if you have one of these sort of syllogisms, and they always contain premises, but as long as the premises are true and you go through the logic and the logic is sound, there's actual rules, modus ponens, modus tonens, all those laws of logic. And if you follow those deductive laws properly, then that guarantees that you get the correct answer. Your answer must be right at the end of all that, logicking. And so that's very appealing, because ideally we would want our understanding of the universe to be as rigorous and solid as mathematics and as first order logic. So rationalism attempts to do that. Rationalism is the belief that everything can be proven, and that things that should only be taken as true if they are proven. It's the demand for rigorous objective proof and evidence. And this leads to this kind of attitude, this kind of like skeptic, conservative scientific attitude of like, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you're going to claim something, you need to back it up with sources. You got to cite your sources. You got to cite your studies and all that kind of stuff. So again, you can see how we're formalizing this whole process of sense making and knowledge acquisition. It's the attempt to systematize knowledge. It's the attempt for absolute certainty in knowledge. However, there's an interesting little paradox and kind of contradiction here, because at the same time, rationalism wants to invent a system for absolute certainty in our knowledge. On the other hand, it also will want to deny the existence of absolute truths. Most academics and scientists, if you tell them that something is absolutely true, they'll be very skeptical of that. Because from the pre-rational stages, where people would claim absolute truth in God or absolute truth in Jesus or whatever, scientists have become very skeptical of that, because where's the evidence? Where's the evidence that Noah's Ark actually existed? Where's the evidence that miracles are real? You can't claim these things as absolutes without the evidence, and in general, there's a very skeptical attitude towards any kind of absolutes, to the point where absolutes are even denied that they're even possible. Many in the scientific field just believe that there are no such thing as absolutes. Rationalism is, quote, if something is mathematically true, you can be absolutely sure of it because it's a mathematical proof and unarguably correct, end quote. And that's the ideal that we're aiming for. It's the idea of the objective correctness of reason and proof. It's the notion that you can just guarantee truth if you follow certain correct procedures. It's the attempt to rid all subjectivity from understanding and from truth-seeking. The problem of epistemology is solved by eliminating subjectivity. See, that was the real problem in the pre-rational era, is that, you had all this subjectivity. People believed in different kinds of gods and different kinds of mystical woo because, different cultures have their own subjective biases and so forth, and nobody was conscious of their biases, and they were just living out their biases. And so, to develop a formal science, we need to get away from all that. We need to objectivize all that subjective stuff. And we do that by the methods of academia. This is done ideally by inventing some kind of mechanical process for distinguishing truth from falsehood. Rationalism is the idea that truth and falsehood can be distinguished mechanically without intelligence. This is critical. Mechanically without intelligence. A machine that finds the truth. That's the rationalist ideal. In this, there is no fuzzy, soft mind stuff that is required. It's just a machine. Ideally, we would have an AI that would give us all the answers, right? And right now, even today, people are still under this idea that you can just invent an AI that's going to tell you the truth. right? Isn't that what's going to happen in a decade? Is we're just having AI and you just ask the AI anything and the AI tells you what's true and then you just believe it and that's it. That's all there is to epistemology. Leo, epistemology has been solved. All we need is just a better AI that just has more CPU power, GPU power, that can just crunch more numbers, and it'll solve all these philosophical fuzzy problems that you've been talking about. Actualized.org will become irrelevant because we'll just have an AI that tells us all the answers. Or will it? Rationalism assumes that that's possible. Rationalism assumes that the problem of self-deception can be solved by just being hyper-rational, rigorous, formal, and mechanical. This this famous adage of, quote, shut up and calculate. About 100 years ago when they were developing quantum mechanics, the fathers of quantum mechanics, they were arguing about, well, what does it really mean? Is a particle really a wave? Is it a particle? Is it a wave? Is it here? Is it there? What does quantum mechanics really mean? They were trying to figure out the interpretations, and one of the physicists he was this kind of extreme rationalist type, and he just said, "You guys are arguing about all this philosophy. Just shut up and calculate. Shut up and calculate, and then that will be enough to understand reality." Or will it? Now look, sometimes it is appropriate to just shut up and calculate. Sometimes you don't have enough information to do your philosophy on. And so maybe it's right to shut up and calculate. But imagine if you applied that attitude towards understanding everything that I teach, for example, with Actualized.org. How far would that get you? How deeply would you understand reality with that approach? See, a rationalist believes that there's nothing more to reality than just calculations. If reality is just a computer, if that's all it is, then all we need to do is apply that computational approach, and eventually that's going to get us the closest to the truth. But is reality just a computer? Well, that's an open question. Rationalism is the firm belief that this is the right way to go. We need to be more hard, more rigorous. Rid the sciences of all the fluff, all the woo, all the human sentiment. And when a rationalist is confronted with epistemic and metaphysical problems, he just doubles down on the rigor. Technical rigor is the solution. We're just not being rigorous enough. That's our problem. Rationalism is a faith that there exists this master method that, quote, guarantees a correct algorithm for rational thought and action, end quote. It's the default worldview of people in the technical work and technical fields like STEM, programming, business, hard science, academia, Western medicine. Rationalism is a kind of groupthink and a kind of culture that permeates these domains, especially academia. And academics swim in it like fish in water. It's an overestimation of pure reason to solve problems and to understand reality. It's an overconfidence in logical frameworks. It's treating reality like a computer system. Reality is just an algorithm. It's just an equation. All we got to do is just find a few more physics equations and then we'll solve reality. Because everything's just computation. Reality is just math equations after all, right? That's all it is. Rationalism is truth-seeking reduced to scientific studies, lab experiments, and research papers. That's how you do truth-seeking. You don't sit around and do philosophy, you do research studies. And then you get your colleagues to confirm your research studies. And then you publish in papers. You publish a paper in journals, credible journals that have high, rigorous standards for proof and editorial controls and stuff like that. Rigorous peer review. Rationalism is the treating of rationality as an absolute. It turns reason into God. That's a poetic way of describing what it is. It's the notion that reason is the highest intelligence. The explicit or the implicit notion that reason should be king over mind and reality. Rationalism is the pretense that you are a rational being who makes sense of reality rationally and acts rationally. It's the notion that you can build up a rock-solid system of understanding from rock-solid first principles. This is sort of the Cartesian project that René Descartes tried to do, which sort of launched the scientific revolution in Europe. This idea that you sit down and you question everything to rock bottom first principles, and then from that you sort of build up your system of science based on that. And then it becomes indubitable. You can't doubt it because you know it's built on just, solid first order logic. That's just deductive. This rationalism is a kind of autistic nerd approach to explaining and understanding reality. It's a set of ideals, it's a vibe, it's an aesthetic, it's a culture. It's this vibe of facts don't care about your feelings. Hard science, logic, and math are what's real, and everything else is just soft human sentiment. Rationality is just facts and logic and science, and everything else is just pseudoscience. It's a dismissive attitude towards the soft sciences because they're inferior to the hard sciences, because the closer you get to atomic physics, that's like what's real, is atomic physics. And then the more higher up you go, chemistry, biology, sociology, politics, then the further you get away from atomic physics, then the less real it gets. That's what the rationalist believes. It's the attempt to apply the methods of hard science to the soft sciences and to the social domain. So the rationalist doesn't just believe that, atomic physics is what's ultimately real, but then that attitude is applied to the social domain as well. For example, Marxism is supposed to be a scientific approach to economics and to politics. Whereas before that, people had their political ideas and so forth. When Karl Marx came along, the whole appeal of Marxism was that it was supposed to be scientific. Scientifically, mankind is advancing from the feudal stages to the capitalist stages to the socialist stages, and then eventually we're going to get to the communist stages, and this is all preordained and set in stone kind of thing. This is all scientific. And then people actually start to believe that Marxism is this, it's not just a political theory, it's science, which makes it more true, and then makes people believe it even harder. And then, of course, what you get in practice is not what Marxism predicted. And then you start to wonder, well, wait a minute, where's the disconnect? Marxism was supposed to be this rational scientific system, and then we get all this crazy chaos from it. Why is that the case? See, this is an example of rationalism failing when it collides with the messiness and the chaos of the real world, especially the social domain. Rationalism is this attitude of owning people with facts and logic. Reason must rule the passions, reason above emotions and woo. The belief that many of the world's problems can be solved if only people were just a little bit more rational. The conviction that the success of math and science proves that rationalism must be correct, because after all, we landed a man on the moon, therefore science and logic are true. So what is there to do philosophy about? We know how to get to the truth. It's just the kind of stuff that got us to the moon. Let's just keep doing more of that, and then eventually we'll just understand everything there is to understand about the world. It's the attempt to explain everything with physics and with evolution. Rationalists love to invoke evolution, evolutionary theory. Why do men cheat so much? Well, evolution. Why do women cheat so much? Well, evolution. Why this? Why that? What are men attracted to? What are women attracted to? Well, it's just evolution. These kinds of explanations. You've read this kind of stuff. You've heard this kind of stuff. You've heard these kind of arguments being made. And a lot of it is this kind of bro science kind of stuff, right? So there's an element to this whole rationalism project, which is like hardcore serious academics with PhDs. That's like the really rigorous stuff. But then it kind of devolves as it permeates. This is a culture, right? It permeates through society and through culture. So it's not just academics who are doing this. Bros on Reddit, your keyboard warriors on Reddit who are, in the science subreddits, arguing about science versus religion and atheism and theism and this kind of stuff, right? These Reddit bros are also creating their own kind of, bro science, fitness influencers and weightlifters and so forth, they are also invoking this kind of they're not just weightlifting, they're doing weightlifting in a scientific way. They think, they're measuring the muscle size, the muscle mass, and they're measuring the chemistry and all this kind of stuff. And then they're invoking this kind of scientific rationalist language. And then they bring that into their debates about mysticism and about religion and about spirituality. They bring all that in, right? This entire paradigm gets brought in. See, rationalism is like a lens through which you make sense of the whole world. That's why it's so important. That's why we're deconstructing it, is because it doesn't just influence how you do science. This isn't just a topic for scientists. Because when we start discussing and arguing about what reality is, how it really works, you're going to make appeals. Religious people will make appeals to their, to their Bibles and so forth, and then science geeks and so forth will make appeals to science and evolutionary biology and physics and quantum mechanics or whatever else to rationalize and justify their views. And this becomes very dangerous. This becomes rife for self-deception. Core to rationalism is this idea of reductionism. Reductionism is the notion that you can reduce everything to particles, physics, equations, computation, or mechanics. Everything complex and fuzzy can ultimately be reduced down to hard physical systems like atoms and equations. This includes all of ethics, aesthetics, art, religion, philosophy, sense-making, spirituality, even all of it can just be reduced down to neurons in the brain, which are just atoms, ultimately. It's just all chemistry, right? Or is it? Well, the rationalist believes it is. Rationalism is generally unholistic. Its approach to reality is to study very technical, specialized, local aspects of reality, understanding those, and then just stitching those together. And this is sort of the academic approach. You have your physics department, you have your chemistry department, you have your biology department. Even in your physics department, it's subdivided into 20 different subfields of physics. And then, you just specialize in your little narrow field, and you got to do that because otherwise, you're not going to have enough mental bandwidth to understand all the crazy technical detail of each one of those subfields. So you just specialize in your narrow little field, you make that your little niche, and then you devote the rest of your life just studying that. You're humble, you're not too arrogant, you don't try to master every field because that's impossible. And so you're just very humble. This is kind of the rationalist ethos. You're humble, you focus on your little specialty, and everybody does that, and together we will collect this database of knowledge and understanding, and then eventually that's how we'll understand the whole universe. But this is quite unholistic. Because, reductionism in itself is unholistic, because reductionism believes that reality is just nothing more than the sum of its parts. In the end, everything is just atoms. So if you just know the position of every atom in the universe, you're going to know everything in the universe, and that's all that there is to truth-seeking. That's the fundamental attitude. It's attempts to fix complex realities into simplified models. So a lot of rationalism is all about modeling stuff. And then they model and model and model, and eventually they start to take their models as reality itself. Rationalism is the belief that rationality, logic, and science are not relative, they're not subjective, and they're not biased. This is like objective truth. Humans have mathematics and logic, and if we meet aliens in the future, they will also have the exact same mathematics and logic. That's the idea, because this is universal, right? Math and science are universal. It's not that some one culture, there's not Asian math and then African math and then European math. It's all just math. Rationalism is also this kind of masculine thinker personality type approach. On the Myers-Briggs, you have your thinkers and you have your feelers. Well, rationalism forgets all about the feeling. Feeling, you can't understand reality through feeling. It's just all thinking. And it's all this masculine approach. And that's not a bias. That's just objectively how reality is. It's the subordination of the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. It's this overly left-brained autistic view of reality. It's performative formality, rigor, and objectivity. It's this fantasy that you're being very strict and rigorous and literal and objective and factual and scientific when oftentimes you actually aren't. So you see, hardcore scientists subscribe to this kind of paradigm, but also people who are not scientists also subscribe to this kind of paradigm. It's this paradigm that by being this science nerd, that you're actually being very rigorous and that you're doing the best thing possible for having the cleanest, purest, truest epistemology. It's this idea that you can solve the problems of epistemology just by being ultra-scientific. A great example of this kind of performative formalism is Bayesian reasoning. Anyone who talks about Bayesian reasoning, I'm not going to explain it here. It's really nonsense, pure nonsense. But these people who take Bayesian reasoning seriously and who think that this is how you solve epistemology is through application of Bayesian reasoning, this is an example of this kind of like performative formality or rigor. See, you can act as though you're using your mind in a rigorous way and think that you're actually getting to the truth, but you actually aren't. This is the trap. Rationalism is the belief that your worldview is logical and consistent when it isn't. It's the attempt to model humans as rational agents. You know, a lot of economic models try to do this. And then they get all sorts of wacky results because humans are not just simple rational agents the way that you assume. It's the notion that philosophy and metaphysics are unnecessary, or that it's nonsense, or that it's impossible. Philosophy is nothing more than mental games and linguistic confusion. You're not actually solving any kind of problems by doing philosophy. The only problems you can solve are by doing science. Philosophy doesn't actually give you any kind of answers or understanding because it's all just so subjective and fuzzy. But science, gives you hard answers, gives you facts. It's the attitude that science does not need philosophy. It's the belief that reality is made out of crisp, definite, objective categories, thinking in rigid categories and dualities. It's the assumption that there is a set of concrete, objective facts about an external world which is mind independent. There just is an objective world out there that's independent of our minds. And all we got to do is just get the fuzzy stuff out of the way to understand that world. And then we're good. Epistemology is solved. Rationalism is the elevation of the objective over the subjective. It takes objectivity for granted as more real than subjectivity. The objective stuff is what's real. The subjective stuff, that's just human sentiment. Doesn't matter. Subjectivity is just the airy-fairy mystical woo, which is corrupting science that we got to get rid of. Rationalism places rational concepts, models, abstractions above first-person subjective experience. It even denies that first-person subjective experience exists. It even denies the reality of consciousness. Famously Daniel Dennett, who I would characterize as a rationalist philosopher, died recently. Daniel Dennett wrote a whole book trying to argue that consciousness is just an illusion and that all of it ultimately boils down to just atoms and something like that. Rationalism believes that first-person experience is unreliable and not proof of anything. It requires that all truth be third-person verifiable. Somebody else has to verify the truth for you, otherwise it isn't true. Rationalism doesn't believe anything unless it is verified by peer-reviewed studies and research papers. A rationalist will only believe in God if there's a peer-reviewed research paper on God. It's preoccupied with justifying and demonstrating truth as part of a scientific consensus, right? In a sense, the rationalist does not have a notion of personal truth. There's only truth as part of a collective. And that if it's a personal truth, it's not really a truth at all. A personal truth is just some subjective stuff that you made up, to please yourself. Whereas the real truth is all third-person verified. Rationalism is this kind of game of formal academic rigor, the standards of academia. It believes that everything true is accessible to scientific method. And it is scientific method as dogma, and it denies any limits to scientific method. Scientific method is able to grasp everything that's true and everything that's real. Rationalism is also often pragmatism. It's this pragmatic notion of truth, this sort of Richard Rorty notion of truth. Truth just is what is effective. It is utility and value. It confuses truth with survival. It's the belief that science doesn't... So this is sort of a little corollary to the pragmatic thing, is that Yeah, it's the belief that science doesn't really discover truth or prove anything. It's just useful. So see, the rationalist wants to have it both ways. On the one hand, the rationalist just wants to say that science is the truth and everything else is just nonsense. On the other hand, he also wants to say, when you start to question him about truth and about is science really truth, then you're going to back him into a corner and he's going to say, well, wait a minute. Actually, science doesn't really even care about the truth. Science isn't about truth. Science is just about what works. So it kind of tries to play it both ways. Rationalism is the notion that moral questions can be quantified and calculated. So there's this attempt to even apply rationality to moral questions, which is something like, for example, that Sam Harris likes to do. Tries to rationalize, tries to rationalize morality, I guess you could say. Rationalism is the denial that rationality has limits. It's skepticism towards beliefs not grounded in rational argument. It's belief in a sharp distinction between science and pseudoscience, and therefore an allergy to pseudoscience. Right? So the rationalist believes that there is such a thing as science, and then everything else that's not science is, by definition, pseudoscience, and that there's a sharp distinction between those two things. Rationalism is a closed-mindedness to anything mystical. It's an attitude of ridicule and mockery for anything mystical, woo, traditional, religious, or New Age. It's a stubborn refusal to take anything mystical seriously. It's the assumption that anyone talking about mystical things is just sloppy and delusional, not using their mind properly, not following the proper procedures of thinking. Because in reality, nothing can be mystical, right? There is no mystery to the universe. It's just mechanics. And therefore, it's the impulse to demystify everything. Everything mystical must be demystifiable. And of course, therefore, it's a rejection and denial of mystical experience. Mystical experience means nothing because it's just hallucinations, soft, fuzzy human sentiment, wishful thinking. That's all that it is. There's no truth in it. There's nothing deep about it. It's not better than science. You can't understand things through mystical experiences because you can't verify them. You had some hallucination, okay, but so what? You saw a vision of Jesus, okay, but so what? That doesn't mean that it's real. Doesn't mean that it's true. Doesn't mean that, other people see it too. It can't be reproduced in a laboratory. Can't be reproduced in a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Therefore, it's not real. So rationalism rejects experience that cannot be formalized. So it wants experience to be formalized. A thing can only be real if it can be made explicit and repeatably testable in a controlled laboratory environment. Another way to think about rationalism is that it's an attempt to deny God with reason. It's an extreme skepticism applied to everything immaterial and woo, but notice this is a very biased application of skepticism because it never applies that same level of skepticism towards materialism, scientism, rationalism itself. If a thing doesn't fit rationalism, then it is assumed to be irrational and false. It is a kind of hyper-secularization. Everything must be secularized, right? We need to move away from all the old superstitious religious dogma of, the medieval era and move into a modern, technologically advanced, techno-utopia, which is free of any mystical woo. It's like, Leo, why call it God? Don't call it God, call it nothing. Because the God thing, it's like, it's icky. There's an allergy to God. There's an allergy to anything mystical, anything religious. Rationalism dismisses intuition, tradition, lived experience, emotions, qualia, even consciousness. It often ignores contextual, emotional, embodied forms of intelligence. Intelligence is just the kind of technical intelligence. The kind of intelligence that's measured by an IQ, that's real intelligence. Everything else is not really intelligence. Rationalism is the belief that statements that can't be subjected to scientific method, they're not just false, they're not even false, they're just meaningless. For example, a statement like, God is love, that's not true, and it's not even false. It's just meaningless, soft-brained word salad nonsense. It means nothing. Everything is a system to be analyzed. Analysis is the method. Through analysis, we can understand all of reality. Rationalism treats consciousness as an algorithm. Rationalism, you can think of it as a fantasy of control over reality or infinity. It's an illusion of certainty and security in a very chaotic, epistemically chaotic world. It's a craving for guaranteed solutions. That's what science offers. Guaranteed answers. And you don't need to rely on yourself. See, the rationalist has this allergy of relying on their own intuitions or their own convictions about the truth. It's like the scientist doesn't want to believe their own beliefs, in a sense. What they want is they want an experiment to tell them what is true, to give them the guaranteed answer so that they don't bullshit themselves. Rationalism tries to create rigorous ways of thinking as a safeguard against delusion, without realizing that these limits will limit consciousness and limit intelligence and create their own delusion. See, that little wrinkle never occurs to the rationalist. Rationalism is a psychological aversion to ambiguity, fuzziness, relativity, construction, psychology, and metaphysics. It's the assumption that making understanding more and more technical makes it more truthful. For example, in universities, people will write 200-page proofs and, PhD theses on why 1 + 1 = 2. They can't just accept that 1 + 1 = 2. They can't intuit that. No. That's too fuzzy. That's too subjective. We need a 200-page proof proving that 1 + 1 = 2. Then we can be sure. It's this kind of attitude. And that might sound ridiculous, but, very intelligent people have devoted their whole lives just to write 200 pages of proofs on why 1 + 1 = 2. And their proofs fail. See, it's so hard to technically prove that 1 + 1 = 2 that, when Bertrand Russell and Gottlieb Frege tried to do this, 100 years ago, they tried to, Bertrand Russell wrote a 1,000-page logic book just to prove that 1 + 1 = 2 in his logic, and still it failed. That's how difficult that is. But that's the attempt that they're trying to do. It's this horror and terror at insanity. The rationalist really struggles with insanity because all of rationalism is about maintaining sanity, and they're not aware of that. Rationalists consider something like, a philosophy like solipsism, they would consider that absurd. That's absurd. Rationalists might be obsessed with IQ and formal measures of intelligence like that. In a sense, you can think of rationalism as apologia for scientism, materialism, atheism, pragmatism, and reductionism. It's a set of rationalizations explaining why those things are true and the correct way of understanding the world. It's rationality as dogma, the analog of scientism. It's closed-mindedness to ideas which do not fit conventional notions of rationality. It's the arrogance of rationality. You notice that rationality can be quite arrogant. It is rationality which is not self-aware. It is science which is not self-aware. Ultimately, it's a stage of cognitive development. Spiral stage, orange, green, and yellow, these are really the rational stages. On the Susan Cook-Greuter model, the 9 stages of ego development, it's the achiever and the expert stage, and even stages beyond that. And ultimately, we could call it, I funnily kind of call it to myself, rationalism is logical woo. So, okay, that's what rationalism is. We've defined it to death. Now, this is granted as kind of an exaggerated stereotype, right? I've taken rationalism as a definition to its ultimate extreme. This would be like 100 out of 100. Few people are this cartoonishly rationalist. Usually, you're not going to be 100 out of 100. You're going to be 40 out of 100, maybe 30, maybe 80 out of 100, depending on, where your sensibilities lie. But you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised how many people are quite cartoonishly rationalist, especially when you start to argue with them, right? See, usually when a human being is just going through normal life, they're not thinking about these kinds of deep existential topics, then their rationalism doesn't really come out because it doesn't have any reason to express itself. But if you take like a hardcore academic physicist, from MIT, and you sit him down and you start to drill him on these philosophical issues like, well, what is real? Is the mind real? Is matter real? Are numbers real? Are emotions real? You start to, drill him down on this, and then you start to talk to him. Well, what is truth? How do we distinguish truth from falsehood and all this kind of stuff? You start to do that, you're going to see his rationalism come out, and it's going to look quite silly and cartoonish. But of course, that's going to make him look bad. So he's going to try to save face, and he's going to try to soften it up because he doesn't want to come off as just this like logical robot. And, most people are not logical robots. But then again, you'd be surprised at how many are. Here's a list of examples. In case you think I'm just like straw manning and exaggerating, here's a list of examples of people who fall to some degree into this kind of paradigm. We're going to start with the best one, which is lesswrong.com, which is founded by Eliezer Yudkowsky. So this guy is like the poster boy of rationalism. He developed this whole website, lesswrong.com, and this whole community of people who are trying to solve the problem of epistemology, but they're trying to solve it purely in the rationalist paradigm. It's just about how to think more logically, how to be aware of your cognitive biases, this kind of stuff. And look, that's good. It's teaching people how to be rational as opposed to pre-rational. That's great. But then they don't realize there's something beyond that. They call themselves less wrong, and that's right. They are less wrong, but less wrong is still wrong. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's still wrong, right? So ultimately, in this series, what we're trying to describe is what's wrong with lesswrong.com. And there is something wrong with it. It's just difficult to put your finger on it. Other examples of people like this is, for example, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Michael Shermer, Lawrence Krauss, Mark Tegmark, Joshua Bach, Neil deGrasse Tyson to some degree, Tim Maudlin, Eric and Brett Weinstein to some degree, Peter Boghossian. These kinds of characters, you can find interviews with these people online. If you watch a lot of science videos and philosophy videos on YouTube, you'll find these people doing podcasts and doing interviews and doing debates, this kind of stuff, sharing their worldview. You're going to see all of it, in some sense, is kind of rooted in rationalism to various degrees. I'm not saying they're all 100 out of 100, these cartoon characters, but to various degrees. Like Richard Dawkins is a great example of a rationalist. He's pretty high up there as a cartoonish rationalist. Who else? Professor Dave McWest, this channel called Decoding the Gurus. Kurt Jaimungal's channel. I have an interview. I have like a 10-hour interview. If you haven't seen it, go watch it on Kurt Jaimungal's channel called Theories of Everything. So Kurt Jaimungal interviews a lot of these kind of academic, scientific type of people, physicists and so forth, and they try to understand reality. But you can see that he and the people he's interviewing, they're never going to understand reality. He does interview some spiritual people, and that's fine. Like he interviewed Rupert Spira, whoever else, Frank Yang and so forth. So, he's open-minded to mystical kind of stuff, but still, you can see that fundamentally these people will never understand reality at the levels that I'm trying to teach it at, because they're stuck in this academic rationalist paradigm. This kind of cultural phenomena of debunking, these debunker type of people, these are rationalists usually. Another example is this AI Doom debates channel run by this guy called Liron Shapira. Liron Shapira. Tricky name. He's a follower of the Less Wrong community and Yudkowsky. So he's a good example of a kind of a rationalist. This whole AI Doom debate. Oh my God. It's just rationalism crap. New atheism, atheist debunkers, all the atheists on YouTube, Matt Dillahunty, Alex O'Connor, there's a whole slew of these kind of, cosmic skeptic, how do they call themselves? Yeah, there's all these YouTube atheist channels. So all of them are stuck in this rationalist paradigm. What I call these kind of fake skeptics, people who apply skepticism to all the mystical stuff and religious stuff and all the New Age stuff, but they don't apply skepticism to their own paradigm. These are the fake skeptics. The Reddit science bros, online science bro culture. But it goes beyond this. It goes even into stuff like, this is a culture. Remember, this is kind of a subculture. It goes into areas like, Wikipedia editors will subscribe to rationalism. So rational standards will be used to, edit Wikipedia. journalists, researchers, Silicon Valley tech bros, they're generally going to subscribe to this kind of worldview. Other examples of rationalism include economic reductionism, various kinds of schools of economics, logical positivism, strict empiricism, logicism, behaviorism, realism, a lot of Western analytical philosophy, Bertrand Russell, David Hilbert, Gottlob Frege. It also creeps its way into Western medicine. Those who dismiss anything spiritual, paranormal, supernatural, mystical by demanding proof. This James Randi Prize situation, this is pure rationalism. Evolutionary psychology. Stephen Wolfram, he's trying to model the whole universe as just a set of calculations and these little, cellular automata. And just in general, academia, STEM. We're living in a kind of society that is kind of now dominated by technology. Technology is this like supreme power. It creates the most wealthiest companies. All the tech companies are now the biggest, wealthiest, most powerful companies. They have a lot of political influence, of course. They also influence academia. Academia influences them. So there's a lot of sort of incestuous cross-pollination between politics, big tech, academia. This is all going back and forth. And the ideology behind all of that is infested with rationalism. Here's an example of peak rationalism. It's called the Church-Turing thesis. I'm going to quote it here from Wikipedia. It says something like this, quote, "Any method of reasoning other than mathematical logic will lead you to holding contradictory beliefs. From any two contradictory beliefs, you can deduce all falsehoods. Since we don't believe all false things, our brains must run on logic." End quote. That's the Church-Turing thesis. Another example of rationalism is something like this. Here's a list of all the cognitive biases. There's like dozens of them, 50 of them or so. Just study this list, learn this list, apply this to your own thinking process, and this will solve the problem of self-deception. Another example of rationalism is some kind of narrowly designed clinical study that shows that, for example, red wine increases longevity, is good for health. Now, technically, this study has been done properly. It followed all the proper, procedures of how to conduct a study. But the study is measuring such narrow variables, right? It's not capturing the totality of human health. On a couple of, 3 variables that they measured, they selected, maybe longevity, and they selected some protein biomarker, and then they selected some, inflammation biomarker, and then they measure those things and they say, well, red wine seems to improve all these 3 variables. Therefore, red wine, is healthy for you. And then they publish this study, and then in the Nature journal, and it's a well-respected journal, and then everybody, all the journalists go out and say, oh, start drinking red wine because it's good for you. This kind of thing. But it never really occurs to these kinds of people that this is a very narrow study. It doesn't truly capture the holism of what human health entails, nor the diversity of human genetics, how, red wine is going to impact different genetic groups differently and so forth. All these complexities are completely reduced down to some simplistic thing. But it seems like it's rational, right? It seems like this was a solid scientific study. But it's possible to design very narrow scientific experiments and studies that are going to be very misleading. But nobody cares about that because the researchers that were working on this study, to them, they said, well, Leo, but our study was just so technical and so limited. We didn't come out there and say that everyone should start drinking red wine. All we did, we just, technically all we said is that it increases and improves these 3 biomarkers, and that's all that it is. See, they want to have it both ways. They want to say that, but then human beings, when human beings are living, right, they're not living by narrow, nerdy, technical, 3 biomarker nonsense. They need to take scientific facts and so forth, and they need to distill it down into high-level concepts and understanding that then informs how human beings actually live their life, what they eat, how they exercise, how they think about the world, how they do religion or don't, and so forth, right? Humans can't live on technical science research studies. And that is what the human is doing all the time, is it's living. First and foremost, it's living. And even the scientists who are doing these narrow studies, first and foremost, they're living, they're surviving. Only then are they doing science. And this can get lost on them, right? And because of the unholistic nature of rationalism, it's like, well, but Leo, that doesn't matter. That's beyond the scope of science. Who cares? Yeah, of course you're right. Of course you can't just live by scientific studies. But Leo, I'm just a humble researcher. I'm just like a humble chemist. And I just did this little simple study. And so what? See, it's a refusal to take epistemic responsibility because no scientist really takes epistemic responsibility. All they do is they only take responsibility for their little narrow, thesis that they're working on and nothing else. But when you do that, you can't make sense of the entirety of reality. And then the scientists will say, well, Leo, but that's because you can't. That's too much. That's too much to ask for. Another example of rationalism is a robot. Imagine a robot that gets stuck in a logical loop when it's told a specific set of words which cause it to self-destruct because it can't think outside of its own logic. Because the robot just operates, it's sort of this kind of like idea that, Isaac Asimov's, 3 rules of robotics. A robot shall never hurt a person, and a robot shall never do this, and a robot shall always do this, and it's got these 3 rules. And then, you get these science fiction kind of scenarios where, well, what happens if you put a robot in kind of a situation where those rules are kind of starting to conflict and contradict with each other? What's the robot going to do? And the robot is kind of like it's caught in its own logic, and it doesn't know what to do because the robot is not truly intelligent because it's just following these 3 rules. And those 3 rules do not define what intelligence is. Another example of rationalism is, for example, in academic philosophy. If you go into academic philosophy, how do they do philosophy? Their notion of how to do philosophy properly is you're going to go read famous dead philosophers. You're going to read their texts in their original languages, and then you're going to dissect them into technical little arguments. What did he say in this sentence, and what did he say in that sentence? And you're going to look for contradictions, or you're going to look for little minor points that they made, and you're going to make your own arguments, and you're going to justify your argument based on logic and textual evidence. You're going to cite Descartes, and you're going to cite Kant, and you're going to you're going to assemble together this kind of argument. And by doing this, you are doing real philosophy, and you're doing truth seeking, and you're really understanding something about the world. It's important to understand that rationalism is a paradigm held by an ego, by a self, by a mind. This paradigm is doing survival. It itself is trying to survive. It fights tooth and nail to defend itself. This paradigm is not self-aware of its own survival. It is unconscious and mechanical, which limits its intelligence. And it limits its self-reflective capacity. But it is intelligent enough to make strong technical arguments, which is what makes it so self-deceptive and so difficult to deconstruct. Because if you're going to argue with a rationalist, like you're going to try to argue with a Sam Harris, or you're going to try to argue with a Eliezer Yudkowsky or a Liron Shapira, you're going to argue with these people, they're very good at making arguments. They're very logical. They will present facts and evidence, and this is very convincing to a lot of onlookers. You look at these debates and you could be very convinced by a debate. Watch a debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. And you're going to see that Sam Harris makes very powerful arguments against Jordan Peterson. But what's funny, it's so funny, is that ultimately Sam Harris is wrong in his arguments. In his conclusion. His ultimate conclusion is wrong, but his arguments are correct. How can that be? How do we explain that? Have you ever been in an argument with such a person? They're highly rational, highly educated, very scientific, more educated than you. But ultimately, they're still making bad arguments and they're still wrong at the end of the day. So our challenge is, how do we explain this phenomenon? Technically, what makes this kind of paradigm in epistemology and worldview wrong, right? Because if they are making these mistakes and they are coming out wrong, and look, I'm not demonstrating why Sam Harris is wrong. We don't have time for that here, to go into the depth of that. You're just going to have to kind of take me at my word. But trust me, he's wrong on very important things, but he's very good at making arguments. So yeah, how do we explain that? That's what we're trying to explain. Here's a quote that explains the gist of the problem by John Dolan. He says, quote, "These briefly are the key elements of the stereotype. Logic cripples and constrains. It forces one into narrow and mechanical modes of thought that cut one off from the vast range of superior thoughts, feelings, and perception. Logic is an enemy of wit and humor. Logic makes us dull and pedantic. Logic presupposes a simple-minded, black and white, yes-no conception of the world. But logic misses the point of half the things we ordinarily say and cannot match the insight of the humblest person's common sense." End quote. That's the gist of our problem. And by the way, when I say that Sam Harris, is ultimately wrong against Jordan Peterson, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Jordan Peterson makes great arguments. He makes terrible arguments a lot of times, awful, awful arguments. But he is wrong. He is correct on some very fundamental things. And so it's very ironic. How could it be that Jordan Peterson makes such terrible arguments, but then he's correct on such fundamental things? And then Sam Harris makes such great arguments, but then he's incorrect on such fundamental things. See, that's the really interesting thing here. And the problem with rationalists is that they don't just apply their worldview to technical domains like physics, logic, and computer science. They try to apply to social issues, to human behavior, to social science, to politics, to economics, to morality, to ethics, to religion, to history, to business, to philosophy, and to spirituality. But if rationalism fails to formalize even something like mathematics, which it fails to do, which is what Bertrand Russell failed to do, it will certainly fail when applied to politics, to morality, to business, to economics, and to philosophy. Rationalism is a kind of a mind virus that infects academia and spreads outward through society and culture, into business, into politics even. Culturally, it's dominant because of big tech, success of tech, science, and computer science. And see, the success of science, and especially computer science in the last 50 years, has created such a huge illusion that rationality must be true. Because how else can we explain the success of computer science and all the technology that we have? And that turns out to be a very powerful illusion, difficult to deconstruct. Difficult to even see what's the alternative to that. Conservatives like Jordan Peterson love to whine about postmodernism corrupting academia, and it does to some degree, but no one out there is really articulating how rationalism corrupts academia, how modernism corrupts academia. And so in a nutshell, this is my formal explication of that issue, of what's wrong with the lesswrong.com Sam Harris type of worldview. Kant famously said, after reading Hume, that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. And so with this series, I hope to awaken rationalists and academics and scientists from their dogmatic slumber. All right, now let's get into some really deep stuff. So let's go back to that four-part distinction that we made between, reason, reasonableness, rationality, and rationalism. So let me define these for you, and I'm going to be quoting David Chapman here. So reasonableness is defined as, quote, thinking and acting in ways that make sense and are likely to work, but are not formally rational, end quote. Rationality is defined as, quote, formal, systemic, explicit, technical, abstract, rigorous methods for thinking and acting, end quote. It's a kind of a rules-based way of sense-making. That's David Chapman's definition of rationality. This is very tricky because to actually define what is rationality is in itself such a hornet's nest of a problem that I'm not even going to define it for you. I want you to contemplate that for yourself. I'm just going to say that that's his definition. I have a slightly different formulation of it in my own mind. I'm not even going to say it yet because I want you to just contemplate it for yourself as a homework assignment. because it's such a slippery thing. What is rationality? Contemplate. Don't just take my answers. Contemplate, and don't take David Chapman's definitions, and don't look it up and don't ask AI, and don't look it up on Wikipedia. I want you to contemplate that. This is something you must contemplate. And now we're going to define rationalism as just an ideology that makes exaggerated claims about the power of rationality. And it aims for definite proof of rationality's universal efficacy. That's quoting David Chapman. And then David Chapman defines meta-rationality. What is that? Meta-rationality is, quote, informal reasoning about how to best use reasonable, rational, and meta-rational methods together in particular context, end quote. So see, if rationalism is this kind of paradigm and worldview, and rationality is this kind of system of thinking that we're doing, this kind of formal systematic thinking, meta-rationality is not the application of rationality to rationality. This is an important distinction, because if you think it's that, then you're going to be question begging, right? Because the question here, the more fundamental question is, what is rationality and what are its limits? To understand the limits of rationality, you have to go beyond the rational. You can't just apply the same system to itself and hope to be able to understand the system's limits. To understand the limits of a system, the system has to go outside and beyond of itself. And that's what meta-rationality is. So meta-rationality is not a more rigorous, more formal way of doing rationality. Meta-rationality is starting to, in a fuzzy, intuitive way, start to kind of tease apart different parts of rationality and rationalism, and exploring its limits and how to best apply it. So what we're arguing here is that rationalism is bad and it's a self-deception, and it must be discarded. And rationality is important, but it is still limited. It must be learned, but then transcended. And then you're going to use it as a tool. Rationality is a tool. You can apply it in certain cases, but then you're going to have the meta-awareness to understand that, well, okay, I can apply rationality here and here, but then I'm not going to apply it in that situation because it's not going to work in that situation. And I'm not going to apply it over there because it's too limited over there. See? So now let's start to get deep into why rationalism is wrong. There's two main categories of wrongness: epistemology and ontology. The epistemology is actually more fascinating, and it's in a certain sense deeper. There's more content to it. So I'm leaving that for part 2 and part 3. Here we're going to focus on the ontology. So let's start with ontology. Rationalism has an unconscious ontology. Understanding this ontology requires a lot of work and a lot of time and creative intelligence and intuition. It took me 20 years to fully understand what this ontology entails. So what is the ontology of rationalism? And by the way, what is ontology? Ontology is the branch of philosophy that deals with questions of being. What is there? What is there in the universe? What's real? That's ontology. And epistemology is, how do we know what's real? So the ontology of rationalism is as follows. There exists an objective material world that is distinct from you and the self. That's crucial. All of science hinges on this. The world is distinct from the person who is investigating the world. The next item is objectivity is more fundamental than subjectivity. So objectivity is what's actually real. To understand what's real, we need to get out of subjectivity. Another piece of this ontology is that there exist distinct objects. That's just a given. There just are cats and dogs and men and women and trees and atoms in the world. That's just what the world is made out of, these discrete, distinct things. The next piece is that everything has a crisp, objective definition. We can define what is a cat and what is a dog, and they're different from each other fundamentally. We can define what is a man and what is a woman, and they're different from each other fundamentally. They're mutually exclusive. Everything has a fixed identity. By identity, we're saying something very deep. You can wonder, what is identity? That's a whole video onto itself. What is identity? can't ask a more profound question than that almost. But like in this case, what I'm talking about when I say identity is like a cat. What is a cat? That's a much more profound question than you would think, than science understands. What is a cat? And what is a dog? And what is the difference between a cat and a dog? And what makes a cat different from a dog at the identity level? Well, science and rationalism just assumes that there are these identities. A cat just is a cat and a dog just is a dog. Another way to say it is that within rationalism, there is no ontological relativity. Things just are what they are. What a thing's identity doesn't depend on perspective, and it doesn't depend on who's asking and how you're asking. It just is what it is. A cat is a cat. It doesn't matter who's looking at it, how you're looking at it. It just is a cat. Another piece of the ontology is that reality and objects are mind independent. How you think about objects doesn't change them. Another piece of the ontology is that mind can be distinguished from matter. There's mind over here. That's the subjective fuzzy stuff. That's the woo. That's the illusion. That's the not real stuff. And then there's matter, and matter is what's real. Mind is just matter with various illusions in it somehow. We don't know the exact nature of these illusions, but mind, it must obviously just be an illusion stemming from atoms, right? Atoms turn into cells, turn into neurons, and then neurons somehow create this illusion of mind, and that's just all that there is to it. And obviously what's real is the atoms and the neurons, and what's unreal is the mind and the ideas and the fuzzy human stuff. Another piece of this ontology is that all higher order things can be reduced down to atomic facts. So consciousness just is atoms. That's all that it is. There's not two things in the universe. There's not like atoms and then consciousness. There's just atoms, and then consciousness is just some sort of complex combination of atoms. That's all that is. Another piece of the ontology is that qualities are reducible. You can reduce qualities to numbers, to equations, to atoms. What do we mean by qualities? Red, the feeling of salt on your tongue, the sensation of cold and hot, the image of a unicorn in your mind. Imagine a unicorn. See, that's a quality. You have a qualitative experience of a unicorn in your mind. So to a scientist, to a reductionist, to a rationalist, that unicorn that you have in your mind, there's nothing more to that unicorn than just numbers and atoms. It's just some kind of equations. That's all that it is. A very complex equation, computation. Another piece of the ontology is that subjectivity is not real and the self is not real. What is the self? There's no such thing as a self. There's just like atoms and stuff, right? There's a universe, there's a world. The self is just some human made up stuff. It's not real. What is science studying? What does a scientist believe he's studying? Does he believe he's studying the self when he's studying gravity? When he's studying chemistry? When he's doing math? Does he believe he's studying the self? No. He believes he's studying an external world outside of himself. The next piece of the ontology is that reality is nothing more than a machine. And since it's nothing more than a machine, mechanical methods are all that we need to understand it. Another piece of the ontology is that reality is dumb. Reality can't be intelligent. Nothing is inherently intelligent. Another piece of the ontology is that reality is inherently not mystical. There's nothing mystical. Everything can be demystified. If you do your thinking process properly, if you use rationality properly, everything will get demystified into non-mystical stuff at the end of the day. Another piece of the ontology is that consciousness and mind are not fundamental. These are second order, perhaps even third order epiphenomena, not fundamental to what reality is. Another piece of the ontology is that there exist others who can corroborate what is real and what is true. Another piece of the ontology is that reality is finite. Another one is that reality is not a unity. Another one is that absolutes do not exist. And another one is that there is no higher intelligence than the human. Now, a few of these pieces of the ontology, you might, even as a rationalist, you might question. You might say, well, Leo, I'm a rationalist. I even identify as a rationalist, but I don't believe the universe is necessarily finite. Maybe it's infinite. I'm open to that possibility. And I'm not, you said I believe it's not a unity, but maybe it is a unity. Why are you saying that? And, I believe that there might be aliens who are more intelligent than humans, or AI might be more intelligent than humans. I can buy that. So why are you saying these things? Well, the problem is that you don't really understand what I'm talking about. When I say infinite or finite, you don't understand what that means. And when I say unity, you don't understand what that means. And when I say absolute, you don't understand what that means. And when I say something more intelligent than human, you don't understand the consequences of these ideas, right? You understand them in a superficial sense. So a scientist might say, well, Leo, as a scientist, I'm open to the universe being infinite. And science does not contradict science is compatible with a finite universe or an infinite universe. It's an open question. It's okay. We're not dogmatic about that. No, actually you are. You don't understand that all of science is finitude, right? Your entire understanding of the universe is a finite one. When I say infinite, you say, well, the universe might, it might be infinite in 3 dimensions, X, Y, Z coordinates might go on forever. That's not what I mean. When I say infinite, I truly mean absolutely infinite. I don't just mean in 3 spatial dimensions or even in the time dimension. I mean absolutely infinite. You don't know you can't fathom what I'm saying. And you don't understand that all of science is finite, right? You're under the illusion that science can deal with infinity. It can't. That's because you don't understand what infinity is. Likewise, when I say one of your ontological assumptions is that reality is not a unity. So you might say, well, Leo, I believe it could be a unity. Again, you don't understand what I mean by unity. When I say unity, that means reality is so one that there doesn't even exist an other who you can ask if your science is true or real, right? See, as a scientist, you think that you can go and ask somebody to corroborate. You can ask whether it's a human or an alien or just a unconscious, scientific apparatus. You can ask that thing to tell you what truth is. You can use it to corroborate because you think it's other than you. You think you can gather a collection of other people, other minds, and collaborate together to come to a consensus on what the truth is, right? That's because you don't understand that it's a unity. You don't understand that the scientific mind, when it's doing analysis, it's always subdividing reality. You're trying to use subdivision to understand unity, and you don't see that you can't understand unity through subdivision because the very act of your understanding is already subdividing the unity, breaking your ability to understand it. When you say that there are higher intelligences than human, whether it's an AI or an alien, you can say that. That doesn't mean you comprehend the ramifications of what you're actually supposedly admitting to. See, one of the problems with rationalism is that the rationalist truly does not comprehend what higher intelligence beyond the human is. Because all of rationality and all of rationalism, this is only just human in a very narrow space within consciousness, within mind space. If we think of everything as just mind space, it's a very small, very low form of mind space. And everything that you consider rational and reasonable is within that mind space. Anything beyond that mind space, from a rationalist point of view, is going to seem irrational and therefore false. That doesn't mean it is irrational and false. That just means it's outside of your mind space. It's literally outside of your domain of sanity. The rationalist doesn't understand that there exists higher intelligence and higher consciousness than the human, so high that it literally transcends human sanity. And then this is what mysticism is. Mysticism is not the belief in religious dogma and superstition and nonsense. I mean, there are that kind of mysticism. That's bullshit. But that's not what we're talking about. That's not interesting. That's too easy. What we're talking about is a mind that's completely beyond the human mind. That's what truly higher intelligence means. But then for the human mind to understand that mind, it's not going to seem rational. You see, this is the fundamental problem. This is why we need to deconstruct rationality, is not so that you can believe pre-modern nonsense and superstition. It's so that your mind can expand into a higher form of intelligence that is beyond your own sanity and beyond anything the human race considers reasonable and rational. See, but all of these things are lost on a rationalist. But of course, the rationalist, like I said, it's a clever, sneaky paradigm that wants to maintain itself. So it's always going to try to come up with rationalizations against everything that I'm saying here, right? So the rationalist is going to have smart arguments. He's going to make various kinds of arguments and sort of pseudo concessions to things that I'm saying, in order to save face. But fundamentally, what the rationalist is not realizing is that this entire paradigm is it's such a small little island within this giant ocean of consciousness. And that most of the advanced stuff that's way beyond your current consciousness is so far beyond that it's not going to seem rational to you. And it's not going to seem scientific. And that's not a mistake. That's not a bug. That's a feature. That just shows you the limits of your current paradigm, right? But for you to be able to understand those higher things, you're going to have to deconstruct this paradigm, which is what we're doing. But you're so attached to your paradigm with your sense of self, you don't even understand that your entire worldview, all of science, is just a construct of the self to maintain your sanity. You don't even understand that. So because of that, you're going to be fighting for your life and for your sanity. And so literally the things that I'm trying to teach you here will take you beyond your own sanity, which is why you're going to reject them. So back to the ontology. That's the whole ontology, I gave it to you, of rationalism. It's also the ontology of materialism, of scientism. There's a lot of overlap between these things. So first of all, you should notice that all of those points that I gave you about the ontology, all of those are assumptions. They're just assumptions. None of them have ever been proven. Most of them are unconscious. The people who hold these assumptions, they don't even understand that they hold them. They don't understand the consequences of these assumptions. It takes a lot of philosophical work just to become conscious of the assumptions, which is a great example of why philosophy is so valuable and so necessary for science. This is why science cannot do without philosophy, because science is incapable of deeply questioning its own assumptions. Philosophy is necessary for that. See, philosophy is, in a sense, meta-science. It is a form of meta-rationality, see? Because to question the assumptions of rationalism and rationality and to try to transcend it and to see if there's anything beyond it, well, you would need something more general, less specific than a rigorous formal system. Because the rigorous formal system has certain assumptions baked into its very rigorous nature, right? Its laws. Any system of laws you create will have assumptions about the validity of why those laws were selected. If you want to start to question why those laws were selected, why those rules are being followed, you need to go outside of that system. The system can't do that about itself. This is the self-reflection problem. And I'd like you to notice that these assumptions come from conformity for the most part. So here we're connecting with my episode, The Psychology of Conformity. All of rationalism is just conformity. That's all that it is. But it's so sophisticated and pseudo-intelligent. I don't want to call it intelligent. I'm going to call it pseudo-intelligent. Because in my mind, it's not intelligent, but for most people, it seems intelligent, An MIT academic seems intelligent. He's not, but he seems intelligent to the average person. When you see a Sam Harris, arguing with a Jordan Peterson, it seems intelligent. It's not. What they're doing is not intelligent by my standards. But of course, there are many degrees of intelligence here, of course, right? So by human standards, it seems intelligent just because you don't know anything higher. But it is all conformity. Now, back to this issue of what's wrong with rationalism. Rationalism might work if the universe was a finite, deterministic clockwork machine made of objective, definite, crisp, mind-independent parts. But this ontology is fundamentally wrong, which is why rationalists tend to not want to discuss metaphysics and ontology, because if they did, they would realize how bad their ontology is. See, reality is an absolute unity. This has profound and subtle implications for science, for rationality, for understanding and sense-making. No distinction. What does it mean to say that it's absolute unity? That means that no distinction has a fixed objective reality. What I'm saying is that literally there is not a difference between a cat and a dog, fundamentally. But science assumes that there is. Rationality assumes that there is. There is not a difference fundamentally between science and pseudoscience, but rationalism assumes there is. There is not a difference fundamentally between even rationality and irrationality, but rationality assumes that there is. All of science is working on there being these fixed distinctions. See, science doesn't even understand that the building block of the universe is not atoms or equations or computation, it's distinctions. Science and rationalists don't even have enough consciousness to understand that. That's because they're living in a distinct world. They're living in a world of duality. They don't really understand the implications and ramifications of non-duality. What I'm discussing here is non-duality. Non-duality is just another synonym for unity, absolute unity. It's because ontologically we have an absolute unity that nothing is objectively distinct from anything else in a fixed absolute way. All the distinctions are morphing, changing, fluid, and that's the true nature of the world, not a machine. See, a machine has fixed parts. Another way to put it is that absolute unity means that there are no parts to reality. There are no fixed parts. All the parts that you think are separate from each other, these are pseudo-separations, pseudo-parts. They are parts in a, they're parts only as they are conceived by a mind. And the mind doing the conceiving, this is absolutely fundamental. Reality just is a mind that is conceiving of parts and distinctions. And all of this is lost on rationalism. So this brings us to, now we're going to go deep into David Chapman's work. This brings us to the problem of nebulosity, as he calls it. Nebulosity, it's a bit of a pompous word, nebulosity. Nebulous means cloud-like, means fuzzy, abstract, ambiguous, amorphous. So what is the problem of nebulosity? He defines it like this. All of science and sense-making is plagued by categorization and definition problems. Rationality depends upon definitions to work. But what is a definition anyways? That's a very deep subject. Rationality assumes that definitions exist for objects. This is another way to say that it assumes identities, fixed categories, fixed distinctions. Rationality assumes mind-independent definitions. But what if definitions are not mind-independent? What if the mind is defining the object and thereby creating the object, and that's what an object is? How and where do you draw boundaries between things in order to make truth claims? See, this is the problem. If you want to have a formal logical system that deals with, propositions of statements, you need to be able to crisply define what you're talking about. For example, if you want to say that snow is white, well, you need a crisp definition of snow. What is snow? And what is white? And while we're at it, what is? It all depends on the meaning of what is, right? So, but seriously, what is white? How do you define white scientifically? See, a scientist will come in here and say, well, Leo, white is just like, it's a wavelength of light, and it's the 425 nanometer range of light or whatever. It's a mixture of multiple lights. I don't know how they define white, but that's what it is they want to say. But, it gets very, very hairy. And this is a trick, because snow, is snow really white? What about the little blue tint it has, or it's more clear, transparent? How do you define these things? How do you define what snow is? Does ice count as snow? Is an icicle snow? Does it have to be falling from the sky if it's on the ground? But what if dirt is mixed into it? Is that snow still? At what point does it stop being snow? If it's melting, is it snow? Now it's water. Is it still white? Is water snow? See, it gets very confusing. This is the problem of nebulosity that David Chapman is talking about. So for science to work, it needs to be able to identify, categorize, and distinguish objects. The more crisply it can do so, the better it works. But there's a problem. Many, many problems. So many problems, we got to pace ourselves here. I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we get into that, let's cover some of these other examples. Here's some examples. For example, science assumes that there just is such a thing as a planet. But what is a planet, really? How do you define what a planet is? Or, for example, it assumes that there is such a thing as a particle. But what is a particle? How do you define what a particle is? Or there just is such a thing as an object. But what is an object? How do you define what an object is? Or there is such a thing as a human. How do you define what a human is? Is a Neanderthal a human? When did the first human appear scientifically? Or now we get even into more complex things, which are various kinds of abstractions. For example, look, rationalism will assume that there just is such a thing as being rational. But what does it mean to be rational? How do you define that in a rigorous way? Or assumes that there is just such a thing as right and wrong, good and bad. How do you define those concepts? There just is such a thing as science and pseudoscience, but how do you define those? What counts as pseudoscience? See, the truth is that none of these things are ever fully known. It's all just assumed as simple and given. And it works on the surface. It works a little bit. If you're doing basic science, it works. Like if you want to shoot a projectile, you can successfully shoot a projectile without getting into these complex ontological issues. If you just want to, do some chemistry and invent a new drug, you can do that without getting into all this complex ontology. But when you start to do really deep science and you start to get into the quantum physics level, into the real questions of what is anything at all, where did anything, or you go to the very macro scale, the Big Bang, where did the Big Bang come from? Where did anything come from at all? You get into these deep kind of questions, or like, what is life? What is consciousness? What is a mind? What is the self? You get into these deep questions. These simplistic assumptions about just there being discrete objects just working together in a mechanical fashion, all this breaks down. None of this holds, because these were just assumptions. That's all they were. There are no definite boundaries between physical objects, even at the atomic level. There's no objective criterion for which atoms are part of which objects. Nowhere in the universe does it say that here is a cloud and this atom is part of this cloud, whereas this other atom is not part of this cloud. This is the picking out of that cloud out of the sky. The self is doing that. The mind is doing that. See? So this is breaking that distinction that science makes between the self, who is studying the universe, and the universe itself. Because, of course, the self and the universe are one. You are the universe, studying itself. But science doesn't understand the complex, entanglements that this is going to create, the paradoxes that this creates. How many clouds are in the sky today? There is no objective answer to that question. Because what determines what is a cloud? Your mind does. This is not a physical fact you find in the world. How many clouds are there? How many rocks are there on the moon? See, simplistically, under the materialist paradigm, you think that there is an answer to that question. But actually there isn't, because what counts as a rock? Is a pebble a rock? If you have a rock and there's a crack in it, but it's not all the way cracked in half, is that 2 rocks? Is that 1 rock? How do we count that, right? Is a grain of sand a rock, technically? How about a car? Is a car a single object, or is it how many objects are in a car? Who gets to say? See, quantity itself is relative and subjective. How many of what you think there are? How many objects are there in the universe? Is there an objective answer to that question? Does God know the answer to that question? In a certain sense, no, because the very notion of quantity, quantifying things, is something that your own mind is doing and projecting onto the world. This is where that distinction between reality and mind is breaking down, and then we're going to say that there is no such thing as mind-independent objects. All objects are inside the mind. All objects are mind. An object is mind, making a distinction within itself. See? So human perception is too hairy to give rationalism the clean, distinct objects that it needs in order to construct itself. Let's go through a couple of deep examples of nebulosity so you kind of start to see some of the profound implications of it. Because it can seem kind of trivial. You might say, well, Leo, how many rocks are there on the moon? Who really cares? Is that really that germane to the entire edifice of science? Does that really change anything about science? Or like, how many clouds are in the sky? Does that really change how we do science and what science means? And the answer is yes, it does. But you don't understand probably the implications, so let's look at some more examples. Consider an apple, ordinary apple. Now, most rationalists and scientists and materialists would consider that an apple is just a well-defined object that just exists independent of the mind, something that's obvious, given, nothing mystical about it, and it's just objective. It's just a fact, right? An apple is just a fact. But when we're thinking about apples and talking about apples and trying to understand apples, what apple am I talking about? Am I talking about an apple today? One of our juicy giant apples, or an apple from 5,000 years ago? Have you ever seen an apple from 5,000 years ago? It's like a little crab apple. It hardly even resembles an apple, probably barely tastes like a modern apple. Today's apples are these gigantic, genetically modified monstrosities that have been bred over 1,000 years to be juicy and colorful and all this. So in what sense are they the same thing? See, when we're doing science, we're not just talking about specific objects in the world, like this apple, that pear, that banana, specific objects. We're also talking about abstract categories. Apple, how do you even understand what I mean by apple? Apple is an abstract category of thing. It doesn't even refer to that specific apple over there. It's a term for an entire class. But what is a class? Is a class just a collection of atoms? Can we just reduce a class to just atoms? That's all it is, just atoms, calculations, and equations. But you see, atom itself is a class. So you're question begging already. But the human mind, when we're talking about understanding and sense making, which is the primary concern here, to understand reality, you're not just understanding individual objects, you're also understanding abstractions and classes. How do you define what these abstractions and classes actually are? How do you define what an apple is? For example, if I genetically modify an apple with 5% pear DNA, is it still an apple? How do you classify it? If you want to make truth claims about apples and pears and their differences, you better be able to crisply define what is an apple and what is a pear, so you can say, well, it's true that apples are this way, and it's true that pears are this way, and what's true of a pear is not true of an apple. That's basically what all of science depends upon. Do you see how fundamental this is? If you can't make these crisp categories, then you can't make truth statements about different objects in the universe. Look at how interesting this gets. If an apple is growing on a tree, is it still an apple? Where does the apple begin and the tree end? Is it valid to say that an apple is a tree? What's the difference? And I'm talking about the fruit. So the apple fruit, is the apple fruit a tree or not? What's the difference between an apple fruit and the tree? The things that are true of the apple tree, do those apply to the apple fruit and vice versa? If I take an apple and I put it into the fire, is it still an apple? At what point does it stop being an apple? If you eat the apple and the apple is inside your gut, is that still an apple? At what point does the apple stop being an apple and it becomes you? If I cut an apple in half with a knife, just one clean slice in half, how many objects do we have? 2 or still 1 apple? Who gets to say? And what about the little bits, the little microscopic bits of juice and apple particles that are on my knife after I've sliced it? Because you never slice it perfectly. You slice it in half, you got 2 big halves, but what about the residue on the knife? Does that count as the apple? So do we have 2 apples, 2 pieces, or do we have 3? And do we count this as 1 piece, or how do we count this particle sludge that's left on the knife? How do we count that? How do we quantify that? Now, a scientist might want to say, well, what determines whether an object is 1 or 2 is the physical connection. If they're physically connected, that means that they're 1. And if they're not, that means that it's 2. But first of all, why should physical connection be what determines what is an object? Why can't you have an object that is physically disconnected? After all, if we're talking about a cloud, we say that let's say there's one very kind of clear, prominent, perfectly clear sky, but just one clear, prominent cloud in the sky. And we say, oh, look, obviously there's one cloud up there today. Okay, fine. But is the cloud physically connected? No. No atoms at all, if you go to the very micro level, no atoms ever are physically, touching each other. And after all, what is physical anyways? How do you even define what a physical connection is? See, we just assume that there are just these things called physical connections. Not really. Not when you go down to the atomic level. And if the rationalists want to say that the atomic level, which they want to say, is ultimately what is the truth, the ultimate truth is the atomic level, well, at the atomic level, there is no such thing as a physical connection. And yet rationalism depends on physical connections to define what objects are, and then to make truth claims about them. And then, what actually determines what a physical connection is? If I glue 2 things together, does that count as a physical connection? But there are many objects that you would say that's one object that are glued together. For example, you would say, well, that's one car, but the car is glued out of a bunch of parts. If there's oil between parts inside of an engine, does that mean it's a one engine or multiple parts? What is it? If I take an apple and I compress it in a press into a 5% sized cube of itself, is that still an apple? You might say, well, Leo, but so what? Well, you're saying these things, but what does it have to do with anything? Well, you see, because when you're doing science and you're doing your experiments and you're going to be making propositional knowledge claims about all these things, you're going to be using terms. You're going to say something like, snow is white in the most simple sense. Snow is white and apples are such and such, have such and such properties. And, apples are different from pears in such and such a way. But to what degree are those things actually true? They're only true to the extent that you know what you're talking about, right? You have to define apple and snow and white and pear and difference and sameness and all this kind of stuff. And so the problem that happens for logical people is that our macro reality that we're dealing with every day, that we're surviving in, that we're trying to understand and make sense of, is so chaotic and nebulous and amorphous and fluid that it's very difficult to make definitive statements about anything. And this makes sense-making very difficult. If you haven't noticed, sense-making is very, very difficult to do correctly. And this is one of the reasons, is because what rationalism has to do to simplify all this complexity down, it has to simplify it down into little models, little abstractions, and so forth. So you say that, oh, there's apples and pears, but in what sense are there really apples and pears? Or are these just simplifications of your mind? Once you make these simplifications, now you're dealing with low resolution models of the actual thing, and then you start to combine them and do logic on them, and then you get false conclusions. And you're also, when you're distilling this stuff down and simplifying it, you're making all sorts of simplifying assumptions. For example, you're assuming that an apple is mind independent. You're assuming that quantity is mind independent. Is an apple really an objective reality, or does it only exist inside your mind? And how would you know the difference? Here's another example of nebulosity. I'm going to give you a couple of these kind of deep examples, and I want you to really contemplate this, contend with the ontological complexity of what it means to understand reality. Because usually human beings are making sense of reality in such superficial or narrow ways, even scientists, that they're never contending with the real complexity of what we're doing here when we're trying to understand the world. For example, simple question might be like, how long is an elephant? That's a kind of a scientific question. But then the question becomes, what counts as an elephant? Does a mammoth count as an elephant? It's tricky. But let's say we grant you that, okay, this thing here is an elephant. We'll just stipulate that's an elephant by definition. Okay, so whatever's in front of us is an elephant. But then how long is it? Well, how do you measure it? What do you do with its trunk and its tail? Do you stretch them out? How much do you stretch them out when you're measuring it? And then at what temperature are you measuring this elephant? Because depending on whether you're measuring it in the hot jungle or in the cold, tundra, it's going to be a different length. And are you measuring in the morning or in the evening? Because depending on morning or evening, you're taller in the mornings and you're shorter in the evenings. And so it is with elephants, I assume. Do you include the hairs on its nose and tail? Do you include that in your measurement? Do you count the dirt and oil on its hair? Do you include that in the measurement? Is the oil and dirt that's caked onto the elephant's ass, is that part of the elephant? Let's say I want to weigh the elephant and find out its mass. Well, does the oil of the elephant count? Does the food in its stomach, what do we do about that? Is that part of the elephant? Should we consider that part of the elephant or not? What about the dirt on its tail that's caked into its hair? What if one hair is hanging off the elephant's tail and it's detached from the elephant's body, but it's still holding on because it's caked with dirt? The elephant swims around in the mud, so it's just kind of caked on. Do we include that hair in the mass and the length of the elephant? And of course, we have to understand the elephant's velocity, because the length of the elephant literally depends on how fast it's moving through space-time, according to Einstein's general relativity. So if you don't know the elephant's velocity and your own velocity relative to the elephant, and you get your reference frames correct, then you're not going to really know the length of the elephant. So it's relative to its velocity. Is the elephant dead or alive? Because it's going to be different depending on if it's dead or alive. And then how do we know if it's dead? When does an elephant count as dead versus alive? And if finally we measure this elephant somehow and we say that it's 8.246 meters long, how long does that truth last? The elephant is that long for what? For a minute? For an hour? For a day? And then it's different. And then what is a meter anyway? How do we even know what a meter is? How do we even measure what a meter is? So this gets us into like the really deep philosophical issues of science and, empiricism. Empiricism just sort of assumes that we can go out in the world and just kind of like measure stuff and see stuff, and it's there for us. It's just a given. But then when you actually start to get deeper and deeper into the complexities of it, you run into all these problems. And serious scientists who are doing serious scientific work, they're always running into these kinds of problems. And then the question is, how then do you navigate it with your mind? And you're going to say, well, man, all we do is we just study the facts and the logic, and it's just the objective. But it's like, no, because there's so much interpretive work that your mind is doing to make sense of all this stuff. Just to understand what the right, just to understand and to make sense of how do you measure an elephant properly, that already requires a lot of very intuitive, higher order kinds of thinking that cannot be simply boiled down to atomic facts. You're making decisions. You're making judgments, executive judgments about, doing it this way versus doing it that way, interpretive judgments as well. Now you might say, well, Leo, but ultimately, so what? It sounds like you're just kind of like nitpicking stuff, and these are just like little technical problems of, imperfect measurement. Who cares if you measure the elephant this way or that way? Ultimately, the elephant has some kind of length. Whether you can measure it by pulling on its tail or not, who cares? In the end, it's just an object that just exists. Or is it? What if objects themselves are relative? What if there is no such thing as an elephant? Even that particular one right in front of you. What if, in some sense, you're projecting that elephant onto whatever is there? Here's some more examples of nebulosity. Are fruits healthy to eat? Might be kind of a scientific question you might ask, right? Well, what counts as a fruit? And which fruits? Because you're generalizing, to say the category of fruit is an extremely general abstract category. How do you determine what to fit in there? Do berries count as fruits? Is a rotten fruit a fruit? Is a poisonous fruit a fruit? So in what sense can you say that it's true that it's healthy to eat fruits? See, simplistically, some nutrition scientists might say, it is true that it's healthy to eat fruits, and it's also, it's false that eating McDonald's is healthy for you. But based on what are you making those true and false claims? See, there's so much oversimplification that is happening there, right? Because they're not thinking of all the edge cases. They're not thinking about what about if the fruit is rotten? What if the fruit is poisonous? Now, the scientist will say, well, Leo, yeah, of course I can't think of all of these different edge cases. That would take too long and it's too messy. Of course not. So we're oversimplifying stuff. And that's just, all of us scientists, we all know this. Leo, you're not telling us anything new. We already know everything you're saying. No, you don't. You don't understand how problematic this becomes. Because you are making truth claims and you are making sense of reality using these gross simplifications. But then you're not accounting in a holistic manner how this is just distorting everything that you understand about the world. Even the fact that all you're saying is that, well, Leo, I'm just a humble nutritionist, and all I do, I just report these nutrition studies. And of course, they're not totally holistic and all of that, but this is the best we can do. Even when you make that kind of claim, see, already what you're doing, this is the key to David Chapman's point, is that you're not being strictly formal when you do that. See, the fuzziness in your thinking is absolutely critical. Because what we're trying to demonstrate here with all these examples is that strict formalism just doesn't work. It can't work. Not just because it's difficult or it's time-consuming technically, but that literally the ontology of reality doesn't allow for it. It makes it impossible. Reality just isn't this way. It isn't this way where you can reduce it and simplify it down in these ways that are being assumed by science and rationality. So, in order for you to survive and to understand the world, you need to make use of fuzzy, intuitive thinking and understanding and sense-making, which is prior to and transcendent of formal science. and formal rationality, which we would say rationalism. You couldn't operate otherwise. Your mind literally couldn't operate otherwise because you need to be able to make judgment calls. Like, for example, when you say, well, what counts as a fruit? Does a rotten fruit count as a fruit in terms of healthy eating? You would say, no, it doesn't count. But then what are you using to understand that no, it doesn't count, that it shouldn't be counted as part of that category? Well, you're using fuzzy, intuitive kinds of sense-making and understanding, which cannot be codified and formalized because there's way too many exceptions for you to be able to formalize them all and put them into rules or to make any kind of mathematical model of them or a system of rules for how to think properly about these different categories. That's the issue. We're trying to demonstrate that formalism is actually a mistake and that it actually makes sense-making worse, not better. Not always. Sometimes formalism is necessary and good. We're not trying to, we're not saying to abandon all formalism, but we're trying to show the limitations of formalism, and we're trying to debunk this paradigm, this worldview that says that just increasing formalism is the solution to all of these epistemic problems. It isn't. It can't be. Why not? Because you can't even define what formalism is. You can't even define what rational is. You can't define what science is. You can't define what an apple is. You can't define what a cat is. You can't define what a woman is. You can't define what a man is. You can't define what a human is. You can't define what an elephant is. You can't define what an atom is. You can't define what red is. You literally can't define anything because you actually don't know what anything is. This is so fundamental that science completely overlooks it. And this ties in with that assumption about reality being finite. See, all of rationalism assumes that reality is finite ontologically because finite has to do with definition. Here's the connection. For rationalism to work, it needs to be able to have crisp definitions. To have crisp definitions, the only things that can be crisply defined are finite things. You can't, by definition, define an infinite thing. But if reality as a whole is an infinite thing, then reality as a whole is literally undefined. That's not a mistake or a lack of knowing. That's what it is. It's undefined. So if reality is truly infinite, this is what I mean by you don't understand the consequences of infinity. If reality is truly infinite, which also means it's a unity, that means you can't define it, because in order to define something, you need to go outside and beyond it to define it with. What is a definition? To define something, you have something other to it to define it in terms of, right? Like, what is a cat? A cat is something that has legs and parts and fur and this and that. So you're defining it with other things. But you can't do that if you have infinity. You can't define infinity because infinity is so total that you can't go outside of it to define it with anything else. So this is where the ontology destroys rationalism. Rationalism can't work because reality is infinite. Now you might say, well, how do you know it's infinite? Well, I can't demonstrate that to you here. And part of the problem of rationalism is that a rationalist will expect me to demonstrate it to you here through some kind of formal proof. And of course, that's the whole catch-22 here, is that I can't formally prove to you that reality is infinite. That's the whole point of why we're deconstructing rationality, is so that you can realize the infinity of it for yourself. So that's beyond the scope of this episode. You'll just have to take my word for it for now. But I mean, it requires awakening. In a sense, the entire paradigm of materialism, scientism, and rationalism, you can think of it as just a denial of infinity. That's all that it is, in a sense. Because what's happening is that the scientific mind is just doing analysis. Analysis is subdividing reality all the time without being construct aware enough to see that it's subdividing reality. So it's subdividing reality and then confusing those subdivisions with being out there when actually they are in here. There is this idea that you can separate the subjective from the objective. Remove the subjective and then just study the objective. And you can't do that if what we're talking about is infinity, because within infinity, the subjective and objective are in a unity with each other. And if you don't realize that, then you're going to get everything wrong. I sort of went on a tangent from my example back to this example of nebulosity. So we were talking about which fruits are healthy to eat. Healthy for who? For humans? For cats? For flies? Which types of humans? Different types of humans. Apples could be healthy for them, or fruits could be healthy or unhealthy for them. You know, maybe there's animals for whom fruits are unhealthy. But when we say fruits are healthy to eat, when we just say that and we say that that's true, some nutritionists say that, see, there's all sorts of assumptions like, well, we're talking about humans and we're not talking about cats or elephants or other creatures, aliens. And now that's the scientist would say, well, yeah, Leo, that's obvious. We're just kind of simplifying. Yeah, but the point is that your mind is still able to make sense of these simplifications. And this is absolutely essential for you to make sense of reality, is that you're always operating with these kinds of simplifications, abstractions, fuzzy, nebulous concepts, none of which are ever fully defined, ever. You cannot define what a cat is. You cannot define what anything is. And yet your mind still understands it, still works with it somehow. That's because the essence of mind is an informal process. And if you don't understand and appreciate that and see the power of that, the power lies in its informality. That's why it's powerful. When you formalize it, you lose its power. You actually lose its robustness. It's robust because it's informal. It's nebulous. This is essential to proper use of the mind. Why are we talking about this? Because this is actually a way for us to overcome some of the deepest self-deceptions of the mind, which are committed by the scientific mind, not by the pre-rational mind, by the rational and by the modern mind, not the pre-modern mind. The deceptions of the pre-modern mind are too easy. They're uninteresting. We say, let's say an apple is healthy, but are the seeds inside the apple healthy? Are they? They contain cyanide. Are fruits sprayed with pesticides, are those considered healthy? What about GMO fruits? How do you know if those are healthy? How much fruit? Maybe up to a certain point, fruit are healthy, but then beyond that point, they're not healthy anymore. So in what sense can you even say that? Like, look, you might say, well, Leo, we can qualify. We can say specific kinds of fruits like apples are healthy for human beings. That statement is true. Well, maybe it's not true when you consider the apple seeds, and maybe if you consider eating a ton of the apples, it's no longer true. You'll say, okay, Leo, let's qualify further. Let's say apples are healthy for human beings as long as you don't eat the apple seeds, and also you don't eat too much of it. You keep it under a certain amount. But then even that's not going to work, because you could say, well, what about people with a certain genetic disorder? Is that healthy for them? And you could say, okay, we can qualify further. Apples are healthy for these kinds of people who don't have this kind of genetic disorder, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but what if we cook the apples and we overcook them? Does that count? So now we have to qualify. Raw apples are healthy, but not the overcooked ones. See, and this goes on forever. There's no end to this. Is ketchup a fruit? Is orange juice a fruit? Is refined sugar from apples a fruit? Is a nut a fruit? Is a plastic apple a fruit? Is a plastic apple a fruit? Now you might say, well, obviously, Leo, a plastic apple is not a fruit. That's just silly. Yeah, but see, if we're in a room together and I say, hand me that apple over there, and you look over there and it's a plastic apple, it's obviously plastic, you're not deceived. You grab it, you hand it to me, no questions, no concerns. It just works. You understand exactly what I'm talking about. Even though that apple wasn't a real apple, it was just a plastic apple. But you still understood what I told you. That's because your mind is so advanced. Your understanding is so fucking advanced, and you have no comprehension of how advanced your own understanding is, that it doesn't matter, right? You're not like a logical computer or robot where it's like, you tell a robot, hand me that apple. And the robot looks over it and says, no, that's not an apple. That's a plastic thing. See, that's because if the robot was programmed with these kinds of logical rules, it wouldn't have enough sophistication and intelligence to really be able to interpret what you're saying. Now you might say, well, Leo, but AI are really smart these days. They're able to understand all this intuitive stuff. Exactly. The only reason AI is so intelligent, notice this, is because these computer scientists have figured out a way to create this intuitive, fuzzy, nebulous black box, which they have no idea how it actually works. They just, create it somehow through some sort of mechanical process. They create it, but then this thing somehow works in a very fuzzy, mystical, almost way. You have no idea how it actually works, and then it's able to understand the difference between an apple and a plastic apple and all these sorts of nuances and so forth, which could never be captured in any kind of formal system. Notice that you could not create an AI using formal, logical rules. And so in order to reach the kind of level of intelligence that humans have, you had to abandon the logical rules for creating AI, and you had to go with a fuzzy black box approach. And that's what made it really intelligent. You might say, well, Leo, but so what? Here's the thing. Academia and science is all about taking that fuzzy stuff and formalizing it into, a scientific method and all of that, thinking that solves the problem of self-deception and that you're going to be able to use that to understand reality at the highest levels. And that's not going to work. That's the point. And the point is that they don't understand that it's not going to work. And I'm not just talking about in the future, like, in the future there will be things that science doesn't understand because its current method is limited. No, I'm saying that there are very advanced, profound things that I can teach you right now, today, that a scientist and a rationalist will not understand simply because they're operating from that paradigm. And they don't understand that. And therefore, I literally can't teach them the most advanced truths about the universe because they won't be able to comprehend it because their mind is limited by this paradigm. That's the point. More examples of nebulosity. Is the sky blue? What counts as the sky? What counts as blue? Are birds dinosaurs? Is there water in a coconut? There's liquid in there, and if you do a microscopic analysis, most of that liquid is water. But if, let's say, I needed water for some sort of laboratory experiment, could I use a coconut to get that water? No, probably not, even though technically there is water in a coconut. Or is there? Depends on how you want to look at it. See, the issue here is that the question of is there water in a coconut doesn't have an objective answer. It all depends relativistically on what you are asking the question for, its purpose, what you need it to do for you. That's nebulosity. Nebulosity is not just about objects not being concrete enough and crisp enough and defined enough. It's also about how we're using these concepts as well, how we're using and talking about these objects. Here's an interesting philosophical question. There are these debates about trans. Are trans women really women and so forth? Here's a really interesting way to phrase it. Let's say in 100 years, we have the technology to do perfect surgery to give a biological woman a working penis and sperm and hormones so that all of it works and she's able to impregnate a biological woman. Is she still a woman or is she now a man? That's the really interesting question with the trans question, right? Because right now we don't have good enough surgery to do this. But in 100 years, you can imagine that we will have this kind of surgery available. Well, in that case, what really is a man and a woman? I'd like you to contemplate that for yourself. There are also higher order questions that we ask and that we deal with all the time for sense-making purposes. For example, is that person a Marxist? Is that person a fascist? Is that person a Nazi? Oftentimes, there are not objective answers to these questions. And notice that the term science is itself nebulous. What is science? I dare you to define it. For example, is Actualized.org science? How about the term reasonable? I dare you to try to define reasonable. What the fuck is reasonable? That's the most nebulous of terms. What about crazy and absurd? These are nebulous terms. Why does that matter? Well, because when I start telling you advanced truths from rational domains of intelligence and consciousness, you're going to call me crazy and absurd. See, that's part of your sense making. But you can't even define what crazy and absurd are, and yet you're using those terms to try to deny what other people are telling you, to deny certain truths and facts and realities. How about the word truth? Everyone uses the word or the concept truth, but no scientist can define it. I dare you, define what truth is. See, rationalism cannot even define what truth is, and yet it entirely depends upon it. How do you even scientifically answer the question, what is truth? How do you run a scientific experiment to prove that? How do you do a peer-reviewed research study on what truth is? And yet science requires the concept of truth. You can't do science without this concept. Some people say like, oh, well, Leo, science doesn't care about the truth. I mean, you're so not understanding the depth of this problem. Of course science cares about truth. You wouldn't be arguing with anybody if you didn't care about truth. That's the only reason you argue, is because you have some vague notion of what truth is and you think you got it and the other person doesn't. That's the only reason you're arguing. That's the only reason you're debunking or that you're even skeptical about anything, is because you have a deep intuition for truth, but you can't define it. Most of the things your mind cares about, attaches meaning to, and makes truth claims about are hopelessly nebulous and cannot be reduced down to anything formal, atomic, objective, or rigorously scientific. Now here, the rationalists will pull this move and say, well, yeah, Leo, sure, I agree with you. In practice, you're right. We can't do it because, we can't track the exact physical coordinates of every atom in the universe. It's too much. It's too complicated. We can't do all that. But in theory, we could. And the answer is no, you can't. In theory, you can't. This is self-deception. The mind works in a very loose, informal, abstract, nebulous way for very important reasons. Sense-making cannot be strictly formal. And to think that it can is a very deep epistemic and ontological mistake. You cannot treat sense-making like physics and math. Physics, math, science, these are all just small subsets of a larger thing called understanding or sense-making. And you cannot create a separation, because here the scientific person or the rationalist will want to say, yeah, Leo, I mean, you're talking about stuff, I understand all this, but you're not talking about science. We have like scientific questions over here, and then the stuff that you're talking about, these are not scientific questions. And we just have to come to terms with that. But again, see, you're creating a distinction between scientific questions and not scientific questions. But you don't know what are scientific questions and what are not scientific questions, because you can't even define what science is in an objective, rigorous way. And yet you're assuming, you're assuming you know these differences and distinctions, and you're assuming that they actually exist for you to know them, and that your mind is not constructing them. That's the self-deception. Rationalism requires boundaries and categories to be objective, crisp, simple, non-perspectival, non-relativistic. Rationalism makes simplifications of complex phenomena because full descriptions are impossible, and it assumes and requires reducible complexity, but most things are not reducibly complex. Quoting David Chapman, quote, rationalism attempts to reinterpret nebulosity as linguistic vagueness and uncertainty, end quote. And quoting him again, rationalism's goal is to prove that rationality is guaranteed correct or optimal, and nebulosity makes this impossible. End quote. See, to the rationalists, it seems like what the issues and problems I'm presenting here, that they're just linguistic problems. But that's not what is being said. What's being said is that these are epistemic problems, and even deeper, that these are ontological problems. And that you can't fix this with any amount of formalizing your language. Rationalism tries to work around these problems by, quote, adding formal machinery, end quote. This formal machinery obfuscates the problem with counterproductive complexity. Rationalism invents ad hoc machinery to try to overcome these issues. And it seems like it's going to work, but it doesn't work. And it doesn't recognize that. Now, an important little nuance here is that nebulosity does not mean that things are just subjective in a sense of it's just all a matter of opinion and it's all arbitrary and anything goes. Some categories are more effective than others. Nebulosity means, rather, that you have to be very careful here not to make a straw man of relativism. Go see my episode called Understanding Relativity, or Relativism, Part 1, where I make a steel man of relativity, because it's often straw manned. But nebulosity does not mean that anything goes. What it means is that when you say something, you have to qualify it. You have to say that, X is true under these circumstances from this point of view for a certain purpose that I have as a mind trying to understand the world. It gets rid of this simplification in science that science is just this objective, neutral thing. When we're doing science, we're just objectively observing the world. No, when you're doing science, you're asking questions for specific motivated purposes of survival, from a human point of view, from within a human frame, from within a human mind, limited by human sanity. And within that, you're taking a point of view, you're asking questions about certain variables, certain phenomena in the world. All of this is biased, deeply biased. And then you're mixing these things up in your own mind, which biases it even further. And you're adding it to your own worldview and paradigm and sense-making system, which biases it even further. For example, humans evolved from chimps is true from a certain point of view. Did humans really evolve from chimps? Technically, no, because chimps didn't exist when the common ancestor between humans and chimps is not a chimp, it's something in between. Chimps actually evolved, on their own for millions of years alongside humans to become chimps. So our common ancestor is not technically a chimp. But when I say humans evolved from chimps, every one of you understands what I'm talking about, right? Of course, the pedants in the audience, those of you who are rationalist pedants, might say, oh, Leo, no, technically humans did not evolve from chimps. Yeah, you can say all that stuff. But see, if you're smart, if you're actually intelligent, you'll realize that pedantry is not intelligence. Pedantry is a low form of intelligence. A higher form of intelligence is to understand that when I say humans evolved from chimps, you understand my point. I don't literally mean that a human came from a chimpanzee's vagina. That's not literally what's being said. What's being said, if you're intelligent and you're using your intuition in a fuzzy way, I'm saying that humans came from something more primitive than a human, which was kind of chimp-like. That's more of like what I'm saying when I say humans evolved from chimps. For example, when I say the sky is blue, that's true from a certain point of view, right? A pedant might say, well, Leo, no, the sky is technically not blue because, at night it's black and in the morning it's orange. And then, if there's clouds, it's white or it's gray. See, a pedant will do that. That's a lower form of intelligence. But when I say the sky is blue, you're not going to nitpick, which shade of blue is Leo talking about. You generally understand the truth of that statement. See, truth is not this binary thing of like that's true, that's false, and then that's all that there is. Truth is we're capturing shades of truth, different perspectives on truth. For example, when we say that women give birth, a woman is someone that gives birth as a definition for woman. That's generally true. We kind of can all understand and agree with that. But then we also understand there's a lot of edge cases and exceptions where women are not able to give birth. Some women are born without the ability. Other women have, accidents and diseases and so forth that prevent that, whatever. So is a woman defined by the ability to give birth? Technically, no. You can imagine creating an alternative race of women, we might call them, who are just like regular women, but we just completely remove all their ability to have birth. But they still have all the other, let's say, features of women. They have the psychology of women, they have the moodiness of women, the emotions of women, the physical needs of women, and so forth. They might even have the anatomical features. They might have the breasts and all the genitals and so forth, but they're just not able to give birth by some genetic tinkering that we do at the very micro scale. So and they look fully like women. In fact, we could even kind of sex them up a little bit so that they look like extra like women. So that they look even more feminine than than your average woman. So by all intents and purposes, when you see this being walking around, you're going to call it a woman. You're going to think of it as a woman, even though it's not technically able to give birth. So is that still a woman? Well, there's not an objective answer to that. It depends on how you want to look at it. And if I did call it a woman, you would understand where I'm coming from. You would understand what I mean, even though technically it doesn't give birth. Another example, it's kind of a controversial one. For example, I might want to make a claim that men care about truth more than women. Is that true or false? In what sense is it true to say that? And if we say that that's true, let's just grant it to me for a second that that's true in some sense. And again, see that in some sense it plays a very important part. Because I mean it in some sense, and I don't mean it in some other sense. I also may not mean it across the board. I might mean it just as an average, as a generalization. But see, a lot of the truth claims that we make about the world, a lot of the ways in which we understand the world, it's all generalizations. And then the question becomes, what are the right ways to generalize? What are the wrong ways? And then this is where a lot of subjectivity and relativity comes into play. But if we want to say that men care about truth more than women do, is that a scientific statement? See, if you're a scientist and you say, no, Leo, that's not a scientific statement, you got a problem here. Because if there's any truth at all in that statement, supposedly it should be part of science, right? Do you really want to say that science is this very formal thing, but then there's all these other truths outside of science that just science is not going to look at, care about, or just completely ignore? Well, then your science is extremely limited and crippled. On the other hand, in what sense is men care about truth more than women? In what sense can we say that that's scientifically true? How do we demonstrate or prove that? Even if it was true, how do we prove it? That's very difficult. See? And so this kind of gets you into the hairiness. But look, if you as a man, why do I say this? I'm not trying to be like misogynistic or sexist here, but if you as a man are trying to understand women, how women work, how women think, their psychology, which is very important for a man's survival to understand that, because otherwise you're going to be a crippled man. You have to understand women's relationship to truth. It's different than it is for a man, generally speaking. And it's important for you to understand that. And that is part of a larger sense-making that you are doing as you're growing up in the world. And it's also different from science, but it's not also outside the realm of science. We don't want to say that as well either. But what I want you to see is that we have sense making and understanding, which is this giant generalized thing, very fuzzy, very hairy and chaotic and abstract. And then within it, we have a little island that we might call formal academic science. And you might say, Leo, well, so what? Well, the crux of it is that, see, what you really care about as a mind is not really science. Even if you're a scientist, what I'm trying to convince you of is that what's really important is not science. What's really important is that you get this right here. You get the entire thing right. You get sense-making right. If you get sense-making right, then science, you can do science. But if you are only focused on science and you don't get sense-making right, you will get science wrong. Because sense-making is not contained in science. Science is contained in sense-making. You're missing the forest for the trees as a rationalist. And all of this is happening ultimately because reality, the world, the universe is not a clockwork, it's a mind. It's a mind. The difference between a mind and a physical system is that a mind is fluid. It blends between things. It's fuzzy. It's nebulous. That's the nature of mind, is it's fluid. The reason it's fluid is because it's unified, therefore none of the distinctions are fixed. They don't have a fixed objective reality. They all dissolve. They're all temporary. And you can't fix this by sharpening up language or by formalizing it. Rationalism assumes that ordinary language is defective because it's not clear enough. But this lack of clarity and messiness of ordinary language is actually a feature and not a bug. Whether, this is now quoting David Chapman, whether or not an object belongs to a category often does not have a definite true or false answer, end quote. It depends on spectrums and degrees, depends on perspective, depends on purpose. Categorization is contextual. Which category should we use? This is not an objective factual question. For example, categories of mental illness, categories of species, categories of political party, categories of bad science, or this is anomalous data that we should throw away. These kinds of categories, these are not atomic facts that you find in the world. Nebulosity is not merely a matter of degree or ambiguity. It also depends on your needs, your goals, and your purposes. What do you need the concept or category for? For example, what counts as water depends on what you need it for. Is there water in a coconut? Depends on what you need the water for. If you are asking because you're thirsty and you need to quench your thirst, in a certain sense, there is. You can drink a coconut and it'll quench your thirst. If you're asking for the purposes of running a chemistry experiment because you need pure H2O, then no, there isn't. For example, is that object straight? Depends on what you need it for. How straight do you need it? It's straight for the purposes of maybe, some sort of macro purpose, some sort of general purpose. If you're building some furniture and you have a board, it's like, is that board straight? Well, for the purposes of building this couch, yeah, it's straight enough. But if you were going to use this to build, a skyscraper, it's not straight enough. Because the skyscraper requires, because it's so tall, you need everything to be extra straight because the tolerances are so much tighter for what counts as straight. And then if you say, in a technical sense, nothing is ever straight. So there's even a relative factor here of in what sense are you asking the question? And also, what kind of questions are you asking? Your questions themselves are not clear-cut. How do you formulate the question? How you formulate your questions very much determines what kind of answers you're going to get. So there's virtually no truths, absolute truths found at the level of macro objects. And often what's meant by true is just practically true enough, true for a particular purpose. And your mind understands this intuitively without you needing to formalize it. That's the power of your mind. Humans invent and select ontological categories to suit their survival. Categorization is inherently irreducibly nebulous. Ontologically, also, sameness and difference are relative. I'm not going to have time to explain that here. Go watch my long 4-hour episode called Sameness versus Difference, where we go into that in depth. Identity itself is relativistic and mind-dependent. Contemplate that. Doozy right there. Also consider that true and false are not just objective properties of the physical world. For example, David Chapman gives this example. Consider a book full of lies. A book full of lies is not physically false because those are just the book is just a collection of atoms. Atoms can't be false. The falseness of the lies in the book only exists inside of your mind. A mind is needed to interpret the symbols and deal with the meanings in order to make sense of the world. So this simplistic idea that you can just boil down truth to atomic facts just doesn't fly. It doesn't fly. Because when you're reading a book, even if you're reading a science textbook, you might be reading a science textbook and then you find a sentence that says something and then you say, that's not true. Because I did some experiment and showed that that's false. But how do you know that that's true or false? How do you make sense of that? See, it's not in the atoms that it's true and false. It's in your own mind. In the symbols, the connections of symbols in your own mind. Quoting David Chapman, quote, "There exist no definite, absolutely true answers to most questions, however they are stated. There is no objective answer to, is Trump a fascist? There is no objective answer to, is there water in a coconut? There's no objective answer to, are apples healthy? Most issues and objects relevant to human life are macro scale and even non-physical abstractions. We run into questions like, is drinking red wine good or bad for you? These kind of macro, abstract questions, nebulous questions. Should you give your children a vaccine? Does candidate X have a mental illness for this medical study? Like, let's say I'm a scientist and I'm running a medical trial and I want to study depression. So now I have to create the category of depression and I have to somehow screen depressed people to be part of my medical trial. But how do I define what depression is in a formal way? See that how nebulous that is? And then depending on how I define depression, how I filter people into my study, that's going to influence the ultimate conclusion of my scientific study of whether some drug helps or hurts depressed people. For example, the question of like, should you take that UFO video that you saw on YouTube? Should you take it seriously? Very nebulous question. Question like, do psychedelics damage the brain? That's a difficult question to answer in the general. How about this one? Do psychedelics reveal legitimate scientific truths about reality? How do you answer that scientifically? How about this one? Does such and such a thing count as abuse? Or does such and such a thing count as theft? Well, people have different opinions about that. A question like, is this scientific instrument, like this telescope, is it calibrated properly? See, you can't have a formal method for how to calibrate a scientific instrument. You have to actually use intelligence to see whether your scientific instruments are calibrated properly, because there's so many different ways that a scientific instrument could be miscalibrated in 100 different ways. And you can't possibly formalize them all. And yet you need to understand if your instruments are properly calibrated to do science. And how do you know that you judge the instrument calibration is proper when you could be self-deceived about that? See? How do you invent a system of rules to prevent that self-deception? Now we're getting to some really interesting epistemology. These are the real issues that plague science. Or a question like, how do you interpret the results of this quantum mechanics experiment correctly? Lots of disagreement about that. Or a question like, do terrorists have a legitimate grievance against American empire? Are terrorists justified in their violent attacks? What is the rational, correct answer to that question? And you see, I want you to see, you might say, well, Leo, this is terrorism. It has nothing to do with science. But all of it is connected and unified by sense-making, understanding, and truth. Ultimately, when people are arguing with each other about things, they're arguing over truth. Some terrorists will say, yeah, we have a legitimate grievance against the government, and somebody else will say, no, they don't. And you're arguing over truth. And in science, you're arguing over truth. Did the dinosaurs die out because of a comet or because of a meteorite or because of some virus or whatever? You're arguing over truth. All of this is connected by the more general problem of how do you distinguish truth from falsehood? See, your mind is always doing that. You need to do that in order to survive and to understand anything. How do you judge whether what I'm telling you is true or false? How do you judge? See, you say, well, Leo, science is the most true thing that we have, so we just use science. But how did you determine that science was the most true thing we have? Did you read a textbook? How did you know that the science textbook was true? How about a question like, does that computer contain pornography? Well, what counts as pornography? How do you formalize what is pornography? You might say, well, what does it matter? Well, if you have a legal case, let's say somebody is found to have porn on their computer and it's underage porn, and now the government is suing them. Well, now you need to make a legal case whether that was truly underage porn on that computer or it wasn't. Well, how do you formalize that? Which is why our legal system is notoriously ambiguous and nebulous. Laws are specifically written to be ambiguous on purpose. Why? Because if you write the law too formally, then you're going to create all sorts of room for loopholes. And then criminals are going to exploit that. See, do you see how interconnected all this is? It goes so deep. Is that thing over there misinformation? How do you define what's misinformation? Is that person lying? How do you define lying versus delusion versus self-deception versus just a difference of perspective? Is that person gaslighting me? How do you define what gaslighting is? Is that organization over there a cult? How do you define what a cult is? Does that fetus over there have, is that a person with human rights? How do you define human rights? How do you define a person? Is a person born at the moment of conception, or is the person happen when it comes out of the woman's body? When does a person become a person? Here's another interesting example. Is Christianity true? See, the problem is that these rationalists, they don't just argue about science stuff, they argue about religious stuff too. A rationalist will want to say, no, Christianity is not true. But then how do you define Christianity? And how do you define true? And then which version of Christianity are we talking about? There might be some versions which are true and some which are false. And then which parts of Christianity? To say that Christianity is true, do all the parts need to be true or just some of the parts? Like 50%, 80%? Who determines that percentage? Consider, for example, that God existed, but everything else in the Bible was false. So the only truthful part is that God exists, but everything else about Christianity is false. Does that mean Christianity is false, or is it true? In a certain sense, it's false in the details, but it's true in the most important thing. You might say, like, the most important thing about Christianity is if there is a God, that it recognizes a God, right? So if it gets that right, but everything else wrong, is it still worthwhile to teach it? See, these are the kind of nebulous, hairy questions that humans deal with. And not just human scientists deal with it all the time, too. These are issues of sense-making. And you can't just say, well, yeah, there's all these fuzzy human issues, and then there's hard science. And what's really true is the hard science, and then all this fuzzy human sentimental kind of weird chaotic stuff. It's like, yeah, we don't know how to deal with it, but it doesn't really matter because it's not the hard truth. See, you can't even say that because you can't even define this difference. You don't know if that's true. You don't know if this is a valid distinction that you're making. You certainly haven't proved it. You certainly haven't determined this using science. That's not science. That's a vague intuition that you have, at best. Nothing scientific about it. Nothing formal about it. There is no formal proof that the fuzzy stuff is over here and the hard science facts are over here. There's no formal proof of that. See, just to say non-scientific questions do not matter is itself a non-scientific bad form of sense-making. Do you see that? And just to say everything important is scientific, that is not science. You can't say that because that's not science. And yet scientists say that kind of stuff and believe that kind of stuff all the time. They make those kind of arguments. So the key for you to understand here is that making sense of science requires more than science. Rationalism tries to dodge ontology and metaphysics because it would reveal nebulosity and doom the rationalist project. But epistemology and ontology cannot be separated because we have a unity. If objects are nebulous, then statements about those objects must also be nebulous. Rationalism tries to solve this nebulosity by reduction of everything to atomic physics, but atomic physics doesn't apply to macro objects, and it doesn't deal with the actual sense-making world that humans live in. All the things that humans reason about are at the macro scale where physics does not apply. And so in this way, rationality and rationalism creates a flatland. And when confronted with this problem, rationalists double down and try to add more logical structure to try to fix it, because they think that something like this must work, but it will never work. That's the point. The entire domain of concept is nebulous. Mind is a nebulous implicit thing. Here's a long quote from David Chapman. He says, quote, "The hope of rationalism is that some mechanical criterion or procedure could provide certainty, understanding, and control by eliminating non-rational factors. This is not possible because rationality by itself can't deal with the nebulous, macro-sized world at all. Abstract formal reasoning cannot reach into that realm. It requires reasonable activity as a bridge." End quote. So higher order phenomena cannot be reduced to atomic facts, and you cannot say that higher order phenomena are unreal, untrue, unimportant, and unscientific, because they're crucial to human life, and also even crucial to science as well, even crucial in your application of logic and your reasoning about mathematics. Crucial aspects of reality are not atomic facts. For example, what is truth? That's not an atomic fact. What is the self or the ego? That's not an atomic fact. What is consciousness? That's not an atomic fact. What is corruption? What is love? What is intelligence? The understanding of survival, the way that I teach it. What is insight? How does self-deception work? What is a paradigm? What is an orgasm? What is sanity? What is relativity? What is good? What is bad? These are not atomic facts, and yet these are fundamental to your sense of self and to everything you understand, including science. Science and rationality themselves are plagued with higher order questions and issues. That's the performative paradox here, or contradiction, of this rationalist project. What is rationality? You can't define it. Is rationalism the best worldview? That's not an atomic fact. Does scientific method capture all of reality? That's not an atomic fact. Is that thing pseudoscience? That's not an atomic fact that you find out in the world. You can't look through a microscope and discover that the scientific method captures all of reality. See? Is science true? Is not an atomic fact. People just think that science is true is scientific. No, it's not. To say that is not scientific. Or to say something like, everyone should be rational. That's not an atomic fact, and that's not a scientific statement. But people who are deep into scientism and rationalism are not conscious enough to understand this. They lack the self-reflection and the objectivity, as they are professing to be objective. That's the irony of all this. That's the twistedness of it and the absurdity of it. So sense-making cannot be reduced to atomic facts. Natural language is loose and informal precisely because it needs to be. Or over-formalizing it would lead to a severe limiting of the mind, an oversimplification of reality, and to falsehood and error, not to truth. And it would stifle mental creativity. Your mind needs to be loose to handle reality because reality is ontologically nebulous and fluid. And an even deeper point here is that rationalism doesn't merely assume a rigid ontology. It actually creates that reality through projection and self-limitation of the mind. See, what you have is you have an infinite mind as a rationalist. This infinite mind then gets limited by the fact that you want mind and reality, you want the world to be rigid, ontologically rigid, and simple, to fit into these categories. So what happens is that you take an infinite fluid mind and then you compress it down into the rigid categories that you think should be out there, that you want to see, that your ego mind wants, because it's just easier to deal with these kind of rigid categories. And so what ends up happening is that you end up creating it and then projecting it and then seeing it. You see it, you see the rigid categories out there, and then you tell yourself, oh, look, it's exactly the way that I thought it was. The world is made out of rigid, objective categories. How do I know that? Because I see it out there. But then what you're not conscious of is that you projected that and you created it out of a larger, infinite mind. You don't even recognize the world as a mind anymore because all you see is a world out there. You don't see your own self or your own mind. You just see the objective world. Like, Leo, that cat and that dog, that man and that woman, that's not my mind. That's not myself. That's the objective world. And then my mind is in here. But see, you created that different. You created that. And you're not seeing that you created it. That's the tragedy of this thing. You have to see this profound paradigm lock that you've created for yourself. If you insist on it deeply enough, then it'll become your reality, in a sense. Of course, there's limits to that. You can't just imagine unicorns and have them materialize, but when it comes to projecting conceptual categories, you're very, very good at that. When it comes to projecting your own paradigm onto the world, a Christian literally feels like he's in a Christian world. And a Muslim feels like she's in a Muslim world. And a scientist feels like they're in a material world. Why? Because you projected and created it. And it's entangled with your sense of self and sanity, such that when we start to deconstruct it, you're going to feel like you're losing your mind. That's not a mistake. That's exactly correct. See, rationalism is not conscious that the mind is creating distinctions and that reality is made out of distinctions. The distinction between the objective and subjective cannot hold, as rationalism assumes. Physical objects do depend on the subjective ideas you have about them, unlike rationalism assumes. Rationalism does not see how it projects and constructs rigor onto mind at large, consciousness and reality at large. Rationalism doesn't understand that the world is the mind. Rationalism underestimates the degree to which the mind mediates reality. Rationalism assumes that the mind is not central to understanding reality, which it is. This is why rationalism thinks that you can make a computer that will just like plug away mechanically and understand the world. That you can't do that. Because not only is mind central, mind is reality. There is no other reality but mind. And rationalism doesn't take this possibility seriously. It calls it woo. That's called woo. And as soon as rationalism can label something as woo, it doesn't need to take it seriously anymore. All because rationalism assumes mind and reality are objectively distinct things, which they're not. See, once you start to understand what I'm saying here, this now opens up the door to legitimate mysticism. All that mysticism ultimately is just the realization that reality and physical reality and mind are one. That's what mysticism is, ultimately. That's not woo, that's literally what's true. Rationalism also assumes that the self is objectively distinct from reality. But you are reality. The self is reality. There's no other reality but the self. Rationalism takes definition for granted, as though everything just has a definition, right? There is a definition for a cat, a dog, and so forth. This definition question is central because to this problem of demystification. See, the reason that rationalists want to demystify everything is because they think everything has a crisp definition. Mysticism is the recognition that you can't define infinity. Infinity is literally undefined. But the rationalist mind doesn't understand this. It thinks that it can define everything through analysis because it ultimately assumes that reality is finite. And so the rationalist mind ends up projecting its definitions onto the world, and the rationalist mind looks out into the world. It sees finite objects. It doesn't see infinity. It can't see infinity because it insists that the only things that are real are those things that have definitions. But infinity can't have a definition. But if it has no definition, then it's not real, according to the rationalist. See, this is a paradigm lock. But the definition of any object is never fully known because every object is actually infinite and part of infinity. Every object is a sub-infinity of infinity, which is why you can't define anything, ultimately. All your definitions are just vague attempts to somehow reduce the complexity, infinite complexity, down to something, some manageable thumbnail that your mind can work with. See, what you need to start to recognize is that you use concepts to think without knowing what anything is in full. Your own mind does not know the primitives that it thinks in. All the key primitives are undefined, unknown, and implicit. For example, I'm going to give you a list of words here. You're going to know in general what all these words are, but at the same time, you don't know what any of them are. So here we go. Game, man, alive, electron, particle, energy, time, force, truth, concept, rationality, science, intelligent, object, objective, matter, physical, consciousness, mind, formal, quantity, quality, woo, irrational, sanity. Technically, none of you know what any of these things are. On the other hand, you kind of know what I'm talking about when I say these words. You're not that deeply confused. Yet, even though you don't have definitions for any of these terms, you use them all the time to make sense of the world, and you use them all the time in science, too. You couldn't do science without knowing any of these words. So that's the situation that we're in. So what the rationalist needs to notice is that his own process, his own mental process, is not formal or rigorous. It is inherently fuzzy, sketchy, and intuitive. And your mind couldn't work any other way, or if it did, you'd be very stupid. And you certainly couldn't do science, or math, or logic, or anything sophisticated like that. You'd basically be retarded. Like one of those robots caught in a logic loop. See, because think of it, when a child is born, how does a child make sense or understand anything at all? Because the child doesn't have definitions in its own mind. The child's mind is not operating on formality of any kind. How does a child know when you point at an apple that that's an apple? Not formally in any way. The child groks it. The child intuits it through fuzzy, intuitive process. How does a child know the difference between a cat and a dog? How does a child know what, for example, abstract things are? You might tell a child, happiness. How does a child learn what happiness is? How does a child learn what suffering is? How does a child learn what color is? These are gross abstractions. How does a child's mind figure this out? Through a very nebulous, intuitive process. And in fact, I'm going to go one step further for you here. And this is where your mysticism allergy, your woo allergy, watch out. What I want to claim is that the child's process of learning the difference between a cat and a dog is actually a mystical process. So just entertain that idea. I want you to seriously entertain that idea. That without a mystical process, without a mystical intelligence, the child literally could not understand the difference between a cat and a dog, or what a color is, or what happiness is. And that your child would just be like an animal. It would be like a baboon, which doesn't know these higher abstract concepts. So here's the thing that I'm trying to teach you, is that you have a baboon, you have a human child, then you have a human adult, then you have, let's say, a highly rational MIT scientist. And what's the difference between all these? Well, the baboon understands some stuff. Of course, a baboon can differentiate between a cat and a dog, not in a conceptual way, but just, in a perceptual way. The child, the human child, has now more advanced concepts. It has, think of it this way. Imagine that a baboon it's like a baboon lives in a like a purely sensory kind of world with no higher concepts, no abstractions, right? The child gets some abstractions. It learns concepts like happiness, cat and dog, color. It learns about science and so forth. And then as you move up in human development, you learn more advanced abstractions. Now, the human scientist tells itself, well, we're just being rational and scientific. There's no mysticism going on. But really, think of it this way. Here's a recontextualization for you. To go from baboon to child in terms of mental understanding, that is a step up in mysticism. The child is more mystical than a baboon because it's able to understand abstract concepts like color. The scientist is able to understand even more abstract concepts like, relativity, space-time, and all sorts of fancy scientific jargon concepts. That is actually a step up in mystical intelligence. You need more intelligence, more abstract capacity, more intuition to do that. Because you couldn't get there through a formal process. Just like a baboon cannot use a formal process to get to the child's level of understanding of anything. And likewise, beyond the scientist here, you can open your mind so deeply that you expand to a level beyond the difference between a baboon and a child. There's an equal level difference between a child and a scientist, and an equal level difference between a scientist and me. my understanding of reality. That does not compute from the lower paradigm. So a baboon cannot understand anything that it's missing from what the child understands. And a child can't understand what it's missing from what a scientist understands. And a scientist can't understand what it's missing from what I understand. And what I'm trying to teach you is what I understand, which is why we're having this whole conversation. Right? So the problem here is that you're so paradigm locked in each one of these cases that you think that you can't even imagine anything above you. So if you're a scientist, if you're an MIT scientist, I want you to imagine that there's something above you that's more above you than the difference between you and a baboon. And you can't imagine what that is. But I know what that is because I have it and I can teach it to you, but only if you're extremely open-minded. That's where we're at. So fundamental to what intelligence is the ability to handle vagueness, fuzziness, nebulosity, uncertainty, lack of information, ambiguity, perspective. You ask, well, Leo, where's the mystical stuff? The mysticism is just in your ability to understand the difference between a cat and a dog. That's already mystical. Your ability to count from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 is already mystical. You're just not grasping it because you take it for granted. If a baboon got the ability to count numbers, it would think it has a mystical superpower. But you, because you just take everything for granted, because you're just like a fucking baboon in human form, you take everything for granted. Even as a scientist, you take it all for granted. All of your intelligence, all of your understanding capacity, all of your intuitive abilities, all of it you take for granted because you're so fucking stupid. That to you, that's just like, it's nothing. It's nothing. It's just normal. It's just atoms. All it is atoms and neurons. You don't understand the insane mystical intelligence that is inside of you. Just to understand this episode required such crazy levels of intelligence that no other animal on this planet can do it other than humans. And even most humans won't understand what I'm talking about. Mysticism is not about seeing crazy fucking unicorns and shit flying around you and ghosts and whatever. And Jesus, it's about recognizing that all of the ordinary stuff that you thought was just atoms is not actually atoms. It's a profound mystical experience. Your entire life is one giant, incredible mystical experience, and you're just sleepwalking through it as a scientist, as a materialist, as an atheist. That's all. That's all we're talking about here. So let's wrap it up here. We still have a ton of content. All the most interesting content is still yet to come. But before we get to there, just let me give you a homework assignment. You must, if you like this content, you must go read Metarationality.com. A lot of the examples and information that I pulled was from that website. That website is like a book. It'll take you weeks of reading. There's a lot of dense material there, technical material to read through all that stuff. Go read it. Credit again to David Chapman for a lot of me borrowing his insights here and quoting from him and all that. He did some great work. However, his work is still limited. It is still very bounded within rationality, and there's something beyond his work. And in order to understand that, that's what we need part 2 and part 3 for. So we're going to get to that quite soon. So we're done here. That's it for part 1. Please check out my life purpose course. Check out my book list if you're looking for profound books to read. I compile a list of the best books that I've read in my book list. Check out my blog. I'm going to fix that soon and keep updating it more. That's coming soon. And let me just end on this. Part 2 is coming in the next 2 weeks. I know sometimes when I do these series, I can take a long time between episodes. I'm being very careful not to do that because all these parts need to go together. So in about 2 weeks, I'll release part 2. In another 2 weeks, I'll release part 3. So don't worry, all that's coming. In the next month, you'll have the whole 3-part series. All of it will be one seamless, body of work. Make sure that you don't quit halfway through here. Like I said, most people who watch my videos only watch for 25 minutes. Imagine finding this information and then only watching for 25 minutes and missing all of it. How tragic is that? Right? How tragic is that? So you're only going to get from this work what you put into it. I expect you to spend at least 1,000 hours watching and listening to my content. At least. You need at least 1,000 hours to understand what I'm trying to teach you. And so it's very important that you got so lucky that you found this material basically by accident. You stumbled upon it through some YouTube algorithm or whatever. But see, the saddest thing is that people find this content by accident. They're like 1 in a million to find this content. You find it, but then you get lazy and complacent, as we usually do, and then you fall off track, you forget about it, you only watch halfway. I say this because whenever I release one of these deep series, part 1, part 2, part 3, I get like 100,000 views on part 1, 50,000 views on part 2, and then 25,000 views on part 3, which is the most important part. It's baffling just how complacent people are with this kind of information. This information will change your life. I spent 20 years trying to understand this. Seriously. This is like all of my philosophical contemplations boiled down into 10 hours. You think 10 hours is a lot to ask? It's nothing. It's nothing compared to the 20 years I've spent thinking about this stuff. Hundreds of hours, thousands of hours went into just this. And with my work, we're always building towards something bigger. Everything is interconnected. We're interconnecting more and more stuff together. So the best is always yet to come. So make sure you stick around. Do not quit halfway through.